They were a couple who had it all.
Hey.
Their marriage was always something special.
They'd built a successful business.
They were living out their dreams.
Until one day, she didn't come home.
A shopping trip with her best friend has ended in a mystery.
Both women are missing.
Their vanishing leaves the whole community desperate for answers.
To have two people disappear is very unusual. There was a lot of fear.
It was on every news channel.
Could Peachtree City have had an actual murder?
The answer is yes.
They found a van at the airport.
The bodies of both women are in the back.
And as investigators search for a motive, the facade begins to fall.
The storage unit was filled with cocaine.
She found out about the affair. He ended up bugging the phone.
She was done.
But will the truth ever be revealed?
She was beaten to death.
There was a gunshot wound to her head.
He fought for his life.
The way that they told the story, it made you wonder, could it have happened another way?
November 16th, 1995. It's a chilly fall Thursday in Peachtree City, Georgia, a quiet suburban community a half-hour southwest of Atlanta.
Peachtree City was and is an affluent community. It has been ranked many times as among the most desirable places to live by Money Magazine.
You're close to Atlanta, but you also live away from some of the chaos that comes along with a big city.
But local resident Ray Little is deeply troubled when he walks into the Peachtree City Police Department early that afternoon.
He's there to report his girlfriend, Halima Jones, missing.
When was the last time you saw her?
It was yesterday.
Ray tells police that Halima has gone out shopping with her best friend, Ruby Joyner. But she did not return home last night.
I've been trying to call her, but it keeps going over the voicemail.
Even more worrying was the phone call Ray received a little before noon.
He gets a call from Ruby's husband, Lewis.
Hey, Ray, you seen Ruby?
He indicated that he had not heard from Ruby or Halima either. It appears that both women are missing.
Ruby Joyner was originally from rural South Carolina.
We're from a small little town that just got a stoplight maybe 5 years ago.
But as she got older, Ruby saw herself living a much bigger life.
She had decided that she really wanted to pursue a career in tech, which at that time was really a big deal. It was much newer.
Ambitious and fearless, in 1971, Ruby chased her dreams all the way to New York City.
She was determined to do whatever she wanted to do.
She enrolled in an executive training program with IBM.
Not only did the move jumpstart her career, it also led her to the love of her life.
She met Lewis Joyner, who is a very successful computer programmer. The two bonded over computers and technology.
But there was more to Lewis than just writing code.
He was not just smart, he was also charismatic. She loved the way he presented himself.
A native New Yorker, Lewis had grown up in Harlem.
He was kind of a straight-talking New Yorker. Not a tough guy, but someone who was no bull kind of guy.
And if he saw something he wanted, he went after it.
Think we can take you out to get a drink later?
I'd love that.
One date led to another. And before long, the couple had created a beautiful life together.
They were married and settled in the city.
Their marriage was always something special.
They were very excited because they were actually both living out their dreams.
And by the early 90s, the ambitious couple was ready for a new challenge and a new city, Atlanta.
It was really a great place for Black professionals.
There was a major boom of folks migrating from New York City down to Atlanta in the 90s. And many of these people were establishing businesses.
They landed in Peachtree City and bought a beautiful home.
Soon after arriving, the Joyners opened their own business, one that capitalized on the steady flow of people arriving in the booming southern metropolis.
They decided to start a moving and storage company. Louis ran the business while Ruby helped in the office.
Hey, babe.
Hey, how did it go?
Really, really good. And we got their friends we're moving in a couple of weeks as well.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, the information is on there.
Awesome. I will call them tomorrow and confirm everything. All right. Love you.
Within a few years, the business was booming.
They grew it to $2.3 million. That was super huge.
They had come to Atlanta and they had made it.
They were one of the fastest growing Black businesses in the whole United States.
The couple's business wasn't all that was thriving either.
Well, Atlanta is not just a great place for your career. It is also a wonderful place to socialize. And they quickly figured out that that was also important to them. And so they actually joined a social club. And that is where Ruby met Halima.
Halima was divorced with 2 children and worked in education. She was a middle school principal.
Ruby and Louis both became good friends with Halima and her boyfriend, Ray Little.
Ruby and Halima bonded over their love of fashion.
They would shop together a lot and really just hang out and have a good time.
But now, their latest outing has ended in mystery.
According to her boyfriend, Ray, Halima hadn't come home last night.
At first, I thought they were out late. Then I get a call from her husband.
He was shocked to wake up and find that she still was not home.
Do you have any idea where they went yesterday?
I think so. She was talking.
Halima wanted to go to a particular store.
Okay, and you were sure they were just going shopping?
Police do have to consider that maybe they made a choice to leave for some reason.
But Ray is sure that's not the case.
She had 2 young children that she really loved and cared for. They were her world.
Ray said that Halima would never just disappear.
But would Ruby's husband say the same about his wife?
After Ray filed that missing persons report, the detectives assigned to the case reached out to Louis Joyner.
Hello?
When detectives reached out to Louis, he was actually in New York.
Yeah, I've been really worried about her.
When did you last see her?
Yesterday.
The detectives asked Louis when he left for New York.
I just flew out this morning.
Why would a man leave town while his wife is missing?
Ruby Joyner and her husband Louis had built a beautiful life together.
They started out with just a simple moving and storage company that grew a super huge business.
They were living in the Atlanta suburb of Peachtree City and were happy.
But now, detectives are trying to find Ruby and her close friend, Halima Jones.
Halima's boyfriend, Ray Little, had gone to the police and reported her and Ruby missing.
The story is that these women had gone shopping and that they had disappeared.
However, when the detectives follow up with Ruby's husband, Louis, things take an unexpected turn.
When did you leave Atlanta?
I just flew out this morning.
Why would a man leave town while his wife is missing?
Louis insisted that it was a very important business trip and he couldn't miss it. He had really kind of been scrambling to get ready and had not put a lot of thought into kind of the current circumstance.
Yeah, I just figured Ruby
had spent the night out with Halima.
Lewis says that once he had gotten to New York and still couldn't reach Ruby, he called Ray.
He said that it wasn't until he spoke to Ray and learned that Halima had not come home either that he actually started getting worried.
He said since he was out of town, he asked Ray to go to the police.
He thought that it would be more effective for it to be done in person opposed to him just doing it over the phone.
Okay, so I take it you haven't found them?
Not as of yet.
Okay. I'll try and get the next flight back home.
Thank you.
Once off the phone with Lewis, the detectives begin searching for the missing women.
Investigators start the investigation by going to the mall.
They were believed to be traveling there on the night that they were last seen.
But when they get there, they ask around, and none of the employees had seen Halima and Ruby.
The mall an apparent dead end. The detectives hit several other shopping centers in the area.
Once again, the detectives come up empty-handed.
No one remembers seeing them.
The detectives are really wondering if the ladies did, in fact, even go shopping that day.
But if Ruby and Halima hadn't gone shopping, where did they go?
At that point, they decide that it's probably best that they start to expand their search.
The investigators alerted their counterparts in Atlanta and other surrounding communities.
They issue a public statement to the media asking for any information.
They said to be on the lookout for 2 women. And they also gave the description of Halima's blue van.
It was not implying foul play, but anybody could read it between the lines that there might be foul play.
The public is on high alert as news of the missing women spreads through Peachtree City.
The disappearance of 2 women who were residents was big news and unusual.
One of the big attractions to Peachtree City was its low crime rate. So people had a sense of security. And so when these 2 women disappeared, it was scary to people.
With fear in the community growing, the detectives bring in the Georgia Bureau of Investigation.
The Georgia Bureau of Investigation assists local law enforcement agencies. And at this time, the Peachtree City Police Department wasn't a large department, and so we were contacted for our experience.
While the investigation gathers momentum, Lewis contacts Ruby's family in South Carolina with the news that she and her friend Halima are missing.
My gut told me something had happened to both of them.
It was totally unlike Ruby to just disappear.
Whatever happened, Ruby's family is determined to find her.
We all got in cars and came to Atlanta, and we went out. We went looking.
But as Ruby's family joins the search, the detectives are starting to suspect this case won't have a happy ending.
Since Ruby and Halima were supposedly going shopping, the detectives pulled their bank records and credit card statements.
But there was not any indication that the 2 had made any purchases.
This is alarming for the police at this point.
Something bad has happened to these women.
And there's no trace of the missing women until November 21st, 1 week after they disappeared.
A security guard spotted a van that matched Halima's in the long-term lot at Atlanta's Hartsfield Airport.
He approaches the van with a flashlight.
And when he shines the light inside, he makes a horrific discovery.
He sees a mound covered by a blanket.
And then he sees what he believes to be a foot sticking out.
One week after Halima Jones's boyfriend reported her and her friend Ruby Joyner missing, a security guard has located Halima's van in the long-term parking lot of the Atlanta airport.
And when he looked inside the van, he saw there was something in the back, covered by a blanket.
A foot can be seen sticking out from under the blanket.
Call 911. Send police here now. Long-term parking, row F.
Law enforcement floods the scene within minutes.
Atlanta police, Peachtree City Police, and GBI all arrive on the scene.
After a week of searching, the two women's whereabouts is no longer a mystery.
Both Halima Jones and Ruby Joyner were located inside the vehicle.
The bodies of both women are piled together, covered by a very large blanket.
They were obviously victims of a murder.
Because of the state of the bodies, it was determined they had been dead for several days.
They were probably killed the night they went missing.
But they died in very different ways.
Halima had a singular shot to the back of the head.
Outside of the gunshot wound, her body was essentially pristine.
Whereas Ruby had been badly beaten.
She had facial contusions, blackened eyes.
Bruising on her neck also indicates that Ruby had been strangled.
It is remarkable that the two bodies were in completely different states. That's kind of a head scratcher.
Even more puzzling, there's evidence to suggest that the women may have been killed in a different location.
Ruby is covered in vegetation. It looks like she was dragged through some underbrush.
There was also signs of a struggle.
Ruby had on a camisole top, which was a little bit strange for that time of year, but it also looked as though there was the cuff of a black sweater around her wrist,
which suggested that the killer ripped off her sweater during the struggle.
But beyond that, the van offers little in the way of evidence.
There were no shell casings, there were no fingerprints, and there was no DNA evidence.
While the medical examiner's team removes the bodies for autopsy, the detectives contact Ruby and Halima's families.
We got a call like in the middle of the night, probably about 3 o'clock in the morning. They asked us if we can come to the police department. They didn't give us any information over the phone.
It's only when they're face to face that the detectives break the devastating news that both women were dead.
The whole thing was just it was just unreal. It's like something that you see on TV. It wouldn't happen to you. It happens to somebody else. This doesn't happen to my family. It doesn't happen to someone that we love. It was just hard. I hope to never have to feel what I felt that night ever again in my life.
The detectives also contact Halima's boyfriend, Ray Little.
Investigators asked him to come down to the station.
However, they were unable to get a hold of Ruby's husband, Lewis.
It was a big question mark. Where is he?
While the detectives try and fail to reach Lewis, the double murder becomes the top news story in Metro Atlanta.
It was on every news channel and covered extensively by the paper.
There was a lot of fear that two women who seemed to be straight arrows could come to this kind of end.
When the detectives sit down with Ray later that day, it's obvious that he's already seen the headlines.
He's absolutely devastated that Ruby and Halima are both dead.
I don't understand, how could this happen?
He says that they were really well loved in the community. He could not think of anybody that would want to hurt either of them.
But investigators wonder if he knows more than he's letting on.
He was the one who reported the women missing, but it's not unheard of that perpetrators of crime do that to try to take the heat off.
The last time you seen Halima was last Wednesday.
Yeah, like I told you. And Ruby? I don't know. A few days before.
But when police ask about his and Halima's relationship, the conversation becomes awkward.
He started to get a little bit uncomfortable.
Is it something you're not telling us?
Well,
he ends up revealing that he and Halima have actually recently broken up.
And the reason sounds a lot like a motive.
He believed that she was having an affair.
Questioned about the murder of his girlfriend, Halima Jones, Ray Little has just revealed that they had recently split up because he believed she was having an affair.
According to Ray, Halima had always been very friendly with a coworker named Howard at her school. She would speak to Howard on the phone. He ended up bugging the phone and listening to Halima and Howard's conversation.
Was she cheating on you?
I don't know.
He doesn't really hear anything definitive.
Still, Ray says he'd confronted Halima about what he'd heard.
What'd she say?
She said I should mind my own business.
After that, she was done.
She broke up with him.
But when the detectives ask Ray if that caused bad blood between them, he denies it.
He said they were actually amicable after their breakup.
If Halima was seeing someone else, could he be responsible for the murders? Or had Ray's jealousy sent him into a rage?
Look, I had nothing to do with this.
Ray is adamant that he really loved Halima and he would never do anything to hurt her.
Ray also claims he was working the day the women disappeared. And when the detectives check, it seems he's telling the truth.
His supervisor confirmed he was at work.
So the detectives bring in Halima's friend, Howard Cunningham.
What?
He is absolutely stunned and horrified at the suggestion that he might have killed two women.
He also denies having an affair with Halima.
Howard was adamant that they did not have a romantic relationship.
When was the last time you saw her?
Wednesday afternoon, the 15th.
After school, they chatted briefly and then went their separate ways.
That Wednesday, of course, was the evening Halima and Ruby disappeared.
And what did you do after work that day?
I went home.
You went home?
I went home.
It may not be the most solid alibi, but at least Howard is cooperating.
Follow me out.
However, the investigators still cannot get a hold of Louis Joyner.
Investigators were very suspicious of him because of the circumstances of his departure.
Their suspicion of Louis deepening with each passing day. The detectives obtain a warrant to search the Joyners' home.
There was nothing particularly alarming.
But when they look through the books for Louis's business, something stands out.
Exactly what we were looking for.
The Joyners had been on the edge of bankruptcy for at least a few years.
That's it.
Could there be some correlation between all these debts and the murder?
With a hunch they're on the right track, the detectives next turn to a storage unit leased to Louis.
When they access the unit, they're surprised to find that it's filled with cocaine.
Had Louis turned to drug dealing to support his failing business.
Dealing drugs could provide a way for him to pay off some debts.
Got a lot in there.
We're gonna need crime team tech out here.
But before detectives can even follow the lead and about the bankruptcy and the drugs, they actually get a phone call.
Homicide.
The call is from a close friend of Ruby's.
She tells the detectives that Halima was indeed having an affair, but the affair was with Ruby's husband, Louis.
And according to her friend, Ruby found out.
Ruby was devastated.
Did she confront Louis about the cheating?
Ruby's friend did not know how Ruby planned to handle it.
Whether it was his drug dealing or the affair that triggered the murders, detectives believe Lewis is the key to solving this case.
There was a nationwide manhunt to locate Lewis.
When the drug evidence was found, a warrant had been placed for him.
And when they're contacted by a man in Atlanta named Gerald Douglas, the detectives sense they're closing in on the fugitive.
Gerald tells them that he and Lewis have been friends for a very long time.
He says that he actually knows exactly what happened to Ruby and Halima.
The next morning, Gerald sits down with detectives.
Thank you for the welcome. Please have a seat.
He starts off by telling them that he'd seen Lewis less than 48 hours after Ruby and Halima disappeared.
Lewis Joyner wanted him to come to New York.
He told Gerald that he needed some help.
So you flew to New York?
Yeah. Like I said, I've known Lewis a long time.
Gerald says he'd met up with Lewis at a bar.
When he got there, Lewis told him that something bad had happened to Ruby and Halima.
He confessed.
He said he was responsible for murdering his wife.
But according to what Lewis told Gerald, he didn't kill Halima.
Okay, so who did?
He told me it was Ruby.
A close friend of Ruby Joyner's husband has just told the detectives investigating her murder that Lewis Joyner confessed to killing his wife.
However, he said that Lewis told him that Ruby had killed Halima.
Why would she do that?
He said she found out that him and Halima had been messing around.
And according to what Lewis told his friend, her rage over the affair had boiled over on the evening of November 15th.
The two women had gone shopping to the Shannon Mall and had arranged to meet Lewis Joyner for dinner, and in fact did so.
Then, after dinner, they'd all driven out to a wooded area near the Atlanta airport.
The three traveled into this noise abatement area in order for Lewis and Halima to consume some powder cocaine.
The women went in Halima's van.
While Lewis had driven separately.
But Lewis told his friend that once the three of them were alone, the impromptu party had taken an ugly turn.
Lewis told Gerald that Ruby pulled out a gun.
Ruby, what are you doing?
Like I don't know. Ruby was not.
Lewis said that she shot Halima Jones in the head.
He said that Ruby also tried to kill him.
She fired at him.
What are you doing? You crazy.
Filled with sudden rage, Lewis wrestled the gun from her.
And then he killed her.
That's what he told me.
Lewis said that he pistol whipped her and beat her to death.
But does the fact that Ruby allegedly killed Halima mean what Lewis did was justified?
The injuries to Ruby Joyner is above and beyond anything that self-defense would require.
When you look at the autopsy report, Ruby was beaten extremely.
She had 23 breaks and fractures in her face. Her nose was broken, her eye socket was broken, her jaw was broken.
She was also strangled.
The medical examiner would call it rage overkill. It's probably the most significant intent you can actually have towards taking somebody's life. You want this person dead.
And he hadn't called Gerald because he wanted to confess his guilt. He wanted help getting away with it.
Lewis wanted him to return to this area around the Atlanta airport and essentially clean up the crime scene.
Lewis asked him to retrieve some things that he had left behind.
What sort of things?
He told me he lost his glasses.
Did you get him?
No.
Gerald said he refused to participate in helping Lewis.
But Gerald is prepared to help the police.
Gerald agreed to lead detectives to the location where Lewis told them the murders occurred.
We placed him in a vehicle and took him around areas of the Atlanta airport and attempted to locate the crime scene using a hand-drawn map that he had made when he had met with Joyner in New York.
When the detectives search the area, night has fallen.
We didn't know exactly where it was. We just kind of knew generally where it was going to be located. And we're examining the area with flashlights.
It's not long before the search reveals the first clues.
We started discovering shell casings up and down the street.
But it's not until the detectives find something else that they're sure they're in the right spot.
We found a sweater lying in the road.
It was a match for the torn cuff they found around Ruby's wrist.
They also find the items Lewis asked his friend to recover.
Items were found, including glasses that belonged to Halima Jones, and more significantly, a pair of prescription sunglasses that belonged to Lewis Joyner.
But there's still no sign of Lewis until November 29th, when an NYPD officer is making rounds in a city housing project.
The New York Police Department do what they call vertical patrols. They patrol the stairwells and the rooftops of these buildings.
The officer encounters a man hanging around on the rooftop.
He was acting suspiciously. I think he was drunk.
Initially, he was just going to shoo him off the rooftop, but I think they did end up patting him down, and they found some cocaine on him.
And when the officer tries to cuff him, a struggle ensues.
They almost fell off a multi-story roof.
That was a very dangerous arrest that was made by the officer.
But it's only after they bring him in that the police realize just how dangerous the suspect is.
He was wanted for murder in Georgia.
A police officer in New York City has just unknowingly taken a wanted fugitive into custody. 48-year-old Lewis Joyner.
He was originally arrested for possession of cocaine.
Once he was brought into the precinct, officers realized he was wanted in Georgia.
But by the next day, the news that there had finally been an arrest in the murders of Ruby Joyner and Halima Jones was all over Atlanta.
It was a pretty big story when he was arrested. He looked like he had been through it. He looked desperate, and everyone, of course, breathed a sigh of relief.
Although for Ruby's family, plenty of questions remain.
Even though it was over, we still didn't have the answers that we were looking for. We didn't know the why. Why did this happen? Did you really do this?
The detectives have similar questions.
We traveled to Harlem with a couple of New York City detectives and made contact with Lewis Joyner at that precinct.
He invoked his Miranda rights, so he did not provide a statement to us.
So all the detectives had is the story Lewis told his friend Gerald.
Not that they believe it.
The investigators charged Lewis with both murders.
The police think Lewis did the shooting and the beating.
Extradited back to Georgia, Lewis stands trial for the double murder in August of 1996.
He'd lost a lot of weight. It just made him look very old, very fragile. It wasn't the same man that I knew.
While prosecutors don't know exactly what happened, they theorize the crime was motivated by Lewis and Halima's affair.
Prosecutors based their theory off the belief that Ruby was the main target.
They assert that his plan was most likely to get Ruby out of the way so he could continue seeing Halima.
And after meeting them for dinner that night, he'd suggested the drive to a secluded spot near the airport.
What is this place?
Oh, this is where they tore down all the houses because it was too close to the airport.
It had been abandoned because there was so much noise that people just moved out, and it just was empty, paved streets, but no houses.
The story Lewis told Gerald about going out there to snort cocaine may have been true.
But according to the prosecutors, that wasn't all Lewis had in mind.
Well, it's my belief that he's the one that introduced the weapon to the scene.
Lewis, what are you doing?
I love you, Halima.
He tried to shoot Ruby and hit Halima instead.
Maybe Halima stepped in the way.
But Halima's sacrifice didn't save Ruby.
Ruby ran into the brush, and he pursued her.
The shots all missed, which explained the multiple casings at the crime scene.
Then, his gun empty, Lewis tackled Ruby.
He beat her down with a gun.
He beat her and beat her and beat her until he probably so tired he couldn't beat her anymore. So he choked her.
My aunt's face was like something in a horror movie. I couldn't even actually recognize her. Who does that? And who does that to someone that you say you love?
There was no doubt Lewis had beaten Ruby to death.
He'd confessed to his friend Gerald.
We also found Lewis's prescription sunglasses. So that clearly placed him at the crime scene. And just the vicious nature of the beating. It was a horrendous interpersonal crime. It was someone who knew Ruby Joyner, and that person was her husband.
When it's the defense's turn, Lewis takes the stand to maintain his innocence.
He sticks to his self-defense claim.
Now, I'll be honest, the attorney he had was a very good attorney because the way that they told the story, it made you almost wonder, did it really happen this way? Or could it have happened another way? I couldn't stomach it, and I didn't know what the verdict was going to be.
But the jury doesn't believe his self-defense claim.
He's convicted for killing his wife, Ruby.
But the defense did raise reasonable doubt as to whether he killed Halima.
Lewis is acquitted of all charges connected to Halima's murder.
The prosecution had theories as to how the crime may have occurred, but there was no conclusive evidence to dictate to us what really happened.
The state just didn't have the evidence to prove that Lewis pulled the trigger.
However, the acquittal doesn't change his fate.
Lewis is sentenced to life in prison.
Thank God he doesn't have a chance of parole.
But to many, justice wasn't completely served.
Halima was having an affair, but certainly didn't deserve to die because of it.
She's got sons. Her sons were very young whenever she passed away. She was a human being. I think it's unfair that nobody paid the price for her life.
And having Lewis where he belongs doesn't take away the pain for Ruby's loved ones.
She didn't deserve her life to end like this. Because of my Uncle Lewis, we'll never be able to talk to her again, smile with her again, have another family reunion with her.
But Ruby will never be forgotten, and her family hopes that her story will caution others.
If you're going through relationship issues, you need to really have at least one person you can talk to, share things with, so that they can understand what's really going on. And my aunt didn't want our other family members to even know that there was issues in their marriage. And that's probably why we didn't know what was going on. But you got to be strong enough to share with someone. They can help you get out of whatever the situation is.
The heavy scent of frankincense and damp stone inside the sanctuary of St. Jude's Parish in South Boston did not merely invoke a sense of sacred peace on the rainy morning of November 12, 1974. It cloaked a sudden, chilling act of violence that would go unanswered for more than 50 years. It was exactly 6:14 a.m. when the sanctuary's heavy bronze bells began their morning toll, but the rhythm was abruptly cut short, leaving only the sound of cold rain lashing against the stained glass windows. Inside the quiet church, slumped near the altar rail, lay 22-year-old parish volunteer and community organizer Maggie Sullivan, her hands folded over her chest in a mock posture of prayer, her wool coat still buttoned, yet her life violently extinguished. There were no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds on her arms, and not a single drop of blood on the polished marble floor. She had been asphyxiated with terrifying, professional precision, wiped clean of any trace evidence, and posed in the shadow of the crucifix as if she were a sleeping penitent waiting for a morning mass that would never begin. The initial response from the Boston Police Department was swift, chaotic, and heavily constrained by the powerful social forces of the era. Blue and red strobe lights painted the wet brick facades of South Boston's tight-knit Irish Catholic neighborhood, casting long, nervous shadows across a crime scene that immediately sent shockwaves through the community. Maggie was a beloved figure, a young woman who ran the church's food pantry, kept the parish registers, and championed local housing reforms. The pressure on the local precinct to secure an arrest was suffocatingly intense. Yet, as homicide detectives combed through the wooden pews, they realized the killer had operated within chilling lack of human error. No fingerprints were recovered from the heavy oak doors. No fibers were found on Maggie's clothing, and the rain outside had washed away any potential footprints on the stone steps. The only physical anomaly left behind was a vintage, tarnished silver rosary tucked into Maggie's hand. Not her own, but an old, pre-Vatican II design, its back crucifix hand-engraved with a single, cryptic Latin phrase, Quidquid sub terra est in lusum proferit. As the days ground into weeks, the investigation hit an impenetrable wall of institutional silence and communal self-preservation. Detectives interviewed the parish staff, the neighbors, and the local laborers who frequented the church, but they ran into a closed loop of absolute discretion. To question the sanctity of St. Jude's was to question the anchor of the entire community, and the local hierarchy quietly but effectively closed ranks. The telephone logs yielded nothing. Maggie's personal diaries, which she kept locked in her apartment desk, were missing, likely removed by someone who had access to her keys before the police arrived. The case began to freeze, transitioning from the screaming front-page headlines of the Boston Globe to the yellowing, dusty shelves of the cold case unit at Area C6, while the tarnished silver rosary sat in a cardboard box in the evidence locker, its metal darkening as the years slowly bled into decades. For 52 years, that silence remained unbroken, a permanent, aching wound for the residents of South Boston, and a haunting monument of failure for the original detectives who had walked the wet stone aisles of St. Jude's in 1974. Maggie Sullivan became a ghost of the past, a cautionary tale whispered by elders, a tragic photograph in a family album. The world around the parish transformed completely, moving from the analog era of paper ledgers and local street informants to the hyper-connected digital landscape of the 2020s. But Maggie's file remained frozen, untouched, and seemingly locked away behind the impenetrable walls of time. But a secret does not stay buried forever when the relentless lens of modern investigative media is turned upon the cold vaults of the past. In early 2026, an independent investigative podcast named The Parish Secrets decided to pull Maggie Sullivan's file from the archives. The host, a former investigative reporter named Thomas Byrne, was not interested in official police theories or the sanitized press releases of the 70s. He wanted to look at the geometry of the crime scene with modern, high-fidelity technology and crowdsource information that the original detectives had been blocked from pursuing. Armed with a digital recording suite, a relentless drive, and his sister, a forensic analyst named Sarah Byrne, Thomas began a weekly broadcast that would systematically dismantle a half-century-old cover-up, leading directly to a shocking midnight arrest at a secluded retirement home. The digital signal of the Parish Secrets did not just transmit through headphones. It cut through the decades-old silence of South Boston like a high-voltage wire dropped into a static pool. When Thomas Byrne released the first episode of his investigative podcast in February 2026, he wasn't expecting an immediate breakthrough. He was prepared for the long, tedious, and often hostile work of cold case journalism in a neighborhood historically known for its insular protective instincts, the unreturned phone calls, the polite deflections from retired Area C, 6 detectives, and the quiet warnings from local figures who wanted the ghosts of 1974 to remain buried beneath the floorboards. But Maggie Sullivan was not just a name on a dusty manila folder. To the older generation of Southie, her unsolved murder was a lingering shadow, a chilling reminder that a predator had walked their sacred ground, executed a brilliant young woman with surgical precision, and slipped away into the freezing rain without leaving a single trace. Byrne's approach was entirely different from the rigid, bureaucratic methods of the original 1974 task force. He did not sit in a precinct room waiting for informants to call. He brought the crime scene directly to his listeners. In his makeshift studio in a converted brick warehouse near the Fort Point Channel, surrounded by high-resolution monitors displaying maps of the old St. Jude's Parish, Byrne analyzed the case with a clinical, rapid-fire, Don Dapp delivery. He stripped away the sensationalized media narratives of the 70s and focused on the physical geometry of the church. He wanted his audience to feel the biting, wet cold of November 12, 1974. He wanted them to hear the heavy, metallic toll of the bronze bells and to understand the absolute impossibility of what the police had found. The focus of the podcast's second episode was the tarnished silver rosary. The original detectives had treated it as a common religious artifact, assuming it belonged to Maggie or had been dropped by a panicked parishioner. They had run the engraving through local church registries, searched the national directories of religious supply manufacturers, and eventually logged it into an evidence envelope where it sat for over 50 years. But Byrne did not look at the rosary as a random artifact. He brought in high-definition digital imaging specialists to scan the tarnished silver at ultra-high resolutions, searching for microscopic details that the analog technology of 1974 had missed. The results, broadcasted live to over 2 million listeners, were staggering. Under 10,000 times magnification, the engraving on the back of the crucifix, quidquid sub terra est in lusum proferit, whatever is under the earth, it will bring to light, revealed microscopic characteristics of a highly specific, obsolete engraving tool, a high-carbon steel diamond scribe. This wasn't the work of a commercial jeweler or a mass-production factory. The depth of the cuts, the unique, architectural slants of the lettering, and the slight, repetitive slip in the letter Q indicated a custom, hand-engraved job. But the real breakthrough lay not in the engraving itself, but in the microscopic organic material trapped in the intricate filigree of the silver beads. Tucked into the deep crevices of the crucifix, the imaging team discovered a tiny, preserved speck of industrial coal dust mixed with a specific, high-grade beeswax polish used exclusively in the maintenance of high-altar brassware and sanctuary furniture in pre-Vatican II Catholic churches. The rosary had not been kept in a jewelry box or a dresser drawer. It had been stored, for a very long time, in an environment saturated with liturgical wax and coal-fired heating soot, the exact environmental signature of St. Jude's basement boiler room in the mid-20th century. Think about the architecture of South Boston in 1974. Byrne's voice boomed through the speakers of millions of devices, his delivery fast-paced, cinematic, and thick with tension. St. Jude's was a massive, stone fortress heated by an archaic, coal-fired boiler system. The air in the lower sacristy and the basement vaults was constantly thick with the scent of burning coal and hot beeswax. The killer didn't bring this rosary from the outside. He didn't buy it at a shop. He took it from the deep, subterranean vaults of the church itself. The rosary wasn't just a calling card, it was a signature of access. Within 12 hours of the episode's release, the podcast's secure tip line exploded. Thousands of listeners began mapping the old layouts of South Boston's parishes, digging through historical directories of diocesan staff and cross-referencing names with the original 1974 witness lists. But among the deluge of fan theories and digital noise, a single, anonymous voicemail arrived at 3:14 a.m. that changed the trajectory of the entire investigation. The caller's voice was heavily distorted, altered by a digital modulator that stripped away all age and gender characteristics, leaving only a flat, robotic hiss. But the details they provided were so precise, so intimate, that Byrne's breath caught in his throat as he listened to the audio file in his quiet studio. "You're looking at the altar, Thomas, but you need to look at the register," the modulated voice whispered through the static. "You're looking for a stranger, but the lock was opened from the inside." In 1974, there was a young curate assigned to St. Jude's named Father John Logan. He wasn't on the official police list of suspects because he was the one who allegedly discovered the body and raised the alarm. But the police never asked why his personal key to the basement archive was found in the sacristy drawer the next morning, or why he was quietly transferred to an isolated parish in Western Massachusetts less than 72 hours after Maggie's funeral. He didn't leave because of grief, Thomas. He left because he had the diary. The tip was a direct, shocking arrow aimed at the heart of the mystery. Byrne did not call the police. He knew that if he ran this information up the traditional law enforcement channels, the bureaucracy would grind it to a halt before anyone could secure a warrant or verify the ecclesiastical records. He needed to verify the location himself. He grabbed his digital field recorder, a high-powered tactical flashlight, and stepped out into the freezing Boston night, driving west toward the old, abandoned rural parishes of the Berkshire Hills. The landscape was silent, locked in the damp, heavy chill of a late winter freeze. As Byrne navigated his vehicle through the empty, winding roads, the towering, dark shapes of old pine trees emerged from the mist like ancient, forgotten monuments. He parked 2 blocks away from an abandoned, boarded-up stone chapel, cutting his headlights, and proceeded on foot, his boots crunching softly on the frozen gravel of a long-forgotten path. The chapel was a decaying, single-story Gothic structure, its windows boarded up with rotted plywood, its slate roof partially collapsed under the weight of decades of New England winters. It was surrounded by a high, rusted iron fence, but the lock on the side door had been cut long ago, replaced by a simple, weathered chain. Byrne slipped through the gap, his flashlight beam cutting through the dense fog, illuminating the dust-covered pews and the damp, rotted altar steps. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp stone, rotted timber, and the lingering, metallic tang of cold coal dust, the exact olfactory signature described by the forensic imaging team. As Byrne moved deeper into the cavernous workspace of the old vestry, his light swept over the skeletal remains of old parish registers, rusted brass candlesticks, and piles of discarded hymnals that had settled on the floor like black sand. This was the environment where the silver rosary had been preserved, a silent, frozen vault of the church's forgotten history. But as Byrne reached the rear of the vestry, where a small office space sat behind a shattered oak door, his flashlight caught something that made his heart hammer against his ribs. Resting on the wooden floor, directly beneath a rusted metal desk, was a small, heavy iron lockbox. The lid was open, its interior empty except for a single, yellowed newspaper clipping from November 13th, 1974, the morning after Maggie Sullivan was found dead in the South Boston sanctuary. Written across the top of the clipping, in the exact, dark blue ink used on the parish registers, was a single, handwritten Latin sentence, In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Beneath it, a second line of text had been scrawled in the same precise, architectural hand. The confession is complete. The seal is permanent. Byrne stood frozen in the dark, the beam of his flashlight shaking slightly as he stared at the handwriting. He wasn't just looking at a crime scene. He was looking at the physical footprint of a killer who had lived in this brick vault, watching his victim from the shadows of the altar, keeping a record of his execution like a trophy. The anonymous tip had been flawless. The ghost of 1974 had a physical address, and the hunt was about to transition from a digital investigation into a high-stakes midnight trap. Byrne stepped out of the chapel, his fingers instantly dialing the secure number for Boston Homicide. He knew he had enough to force their hand. The digital crowdsourcing of the parish secrets had cracked the lock on a 52-year-old cold case, and the midnight arrest of Boston's most elusive predator was finally, terrifyingly within reach. The digital transfer of the encrypted files from the abandoned Berkshire Chapel to the secure servers of Boston Police Department's Area C6 was completed at exactly 4:14 a.m., the progress bar flashing a stark, unblinking green against the dim, caffeine-fueled haze of the Homicide Division. Detective Silas Thorne, a 30-year veteran of the force whose face carried the weathered geography of a city that had spent decades sweeping its darkest secrets under the municipal rug, did not look away from his monitor. Before him, the Digital Comparative Analysis Program was running a side-by-side microscopic comparison of the handwriting found on the 1974 Union Station postcard and the newly recovered Berkshire lockbox clipping. The software's algorithm was processing the spatial angles, the ink drag thickness, and the subtle, sharp slant of the Latin lettering in nomine patris, et filii, et spiritus sancti. When the red comparative indicator suddenly locked into place, displaying a 99.8% match, the silence in the precinct room became a physical, heavy weight. Thorne reached for his desk phone, his fingers dialing the private, unlisted home number of the assistant district attorney, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper that carried the raw, urgent energy of a detective who had finally caught the scent of a phantom. This was no longer a theoretical exercise for a true crime podcast broadcasted to the digital masses. This was a documented, forensic link that connected a 52-year-old cold case to a living, breathing suspect who had spent half a century hidden behind the protective, impenetrable walls of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. The state attorney's office, typically sluggish and cautious when dealing with the politically connected institutions of New England, was forced into immediate, high-velocity action by the sheer public pressure of Thomas Burns' live-streaming investigation. Over 4 million people had downloaded the emergency podcast update within 3 hours of its release, creating a digital dragnet that the city's power brokers could no longer contain, deflect, or ignore. The target of the midnight operation was Father John Logan, the enigmatic curate who had supposedly discovered Maggie Sullivan's lifeless body on that rainy morning in 1974. To the public, Logan was a tragic, saintly figure, a young priest whose promising career had been cut short by the profound trauma of the sanctuary murder, leading to a quiet, reclusive life of administrative service in the isolated parishes of western Massachusetts. But as Thorne's team began tearing through the newly digitized, unredacted personnel records of the Boston Archdiocese, a highly systematic, chilling pattern of containment emerged. Logan had not been transferred to the Berkshires out of pastoral care or psychological rehabilitation. He had been moved under the cover of darkness, his transfer papers signed by the bishop's own chancellor less than 72 hours after Maggie's funeral, bypassing the standard diocesan channels to ensure he was placed in a parish that held no secular administrative ties to the Boston metropolitan area. The paper trail of Logan's long, quiet career was a masterclass in institutional evasion, a sequence of quiet relocations that occurred every time a new investigative unit at Area C6 attempted to reopen the Sullivan file. In 1982, when a young, ambitious detective began cataloging the old South Boston evidence boxes, a fire in the Berkshire Rectory basement destroyed the local parish registries and the personal files of their resident clergy. In 1995, when the first DNA databases were introduced to the state police, a water main break in the diocesan administrative vault in Brighton ruined 30 years of local personnel files, specifically those belonging to the curates assigned to South Boston in the mid-70s. Every time the law drew close, the system shifted its weight, sliding Logan into another dark, unreachable corner of the state until he finally vanished from the active registries altogether, retired to an exclusive, highly secure church-owned facility on the desolate, rocky coast of Cohasset. St. Jude's Haven was not a typical retirement home for the elderly. It was an ecclesiastical fortress, a massive, late 19th century granite manor perched precariously on a sheer, windswept cliff overlooking the churning, black waters of the Atlantic Ocean. The property was completely private, surrounded by a 10-foot stone wall topped with rusted iron spikes, its massive wooden gates secured by modern electronic access codes and private security patrols. It was a sanctuary for the compromised, a silent terminal where the elderly, politically sensitive priests of the region were sent to live out their final days in absolute seclusion, far from the reach of secular process servers, investigative journalists, and the sub-zero chill of public scrutiny. The perimeter is entirely self-contained. Captain Miller of the State Police Tactical Unit said, his laser pointer cutting a sharp, blood red across the architectural blueprints displayed on the command center wall. The only vehicle access is a single, winding gravel driveway that runs from Route 3A directly to the front carriage porch. To the rear, the property drops 80 feet down a sheer granite cliff face into the Atlantic. There are no side exits, no secondary roads, and the private security staff is comprised of retired transit officers who know every face in the South Boston Division. If we roll up there with a standard patrol convoy, they'll have Logan out of the building and into a private, unmarked vehicle before our lead car clears the gate. Then we don't roll up, Silas Thorne said, his hand resting on the butt of his service weapon, his eyes locked on the image of the Granite Manor. We use a silent, multi-pronged approach. We seal the coastal route with 2 Marine units from the Coast Guard to ensure he doesn't attempt to access the private boat slip at the base of the cliff. We drop the tactical intercept team directly at the outer gate to cut the power to the electronic locks, and we move in on foot under the cover of the coastal fog. We have to treat this like an active hostage situation, except the hostage is the truth, and they've had 52 years to prepare their defense. The tactical authorization was signed by the federal magistrate at exactly 10:45 p.m., a high-security color of law execution warrant that bypassed the local municipal courts to ensure total operational secrecy. The convoy of 4 unmarked, matte black utility vehicles rolled silently out of the Area C6 garage at 11:15 p.m., their headlights extinguished as they navigated the empty, frost-covered avenues of South Boston before heading south toward the coastal highway. The temperature had plummeted past zero, turning the light rain into a thick, heavy sleet that glazed the asphalt in a dangerous, shifting sheet of black ice. A dense, suffocating fog was rolling off the Atlantic, wrapping the shoreline in a freezing gray shroud that obliterated the horizon and muffled the sound of the approaching engines. Inside the lead vehicle, Thomas Burns sat in the back seat, his fingers holding his digital field recorder, the low, rhythmic static of the tactical radios filling the dark interior. He could feel the cold, heavy vibration of the tires on the icy road, a dawn-dap, rapid-fire heartbeat that matched the frantic ticking of the digital clock on the dashboard. He had started this journey with a microphone and a collection of old newspaper clippings, and now he was riding into the dark alongside a heavily armed state police unit, about to witness the violent, historic dismantling of a half-century-old conspiracy of silence. 2 minutes to the outer gate, Captain Miller's voice crackled through the tactical earpieces, a low, controlled whisper that carried the absolute finality of the law. Marine units are in position 1 mile off the Cohasset Cliffs. Their thermal scanners are active on the rear veranda. No movement detected. The target is believed to be in his private quarters on the 2nd floor of the West Wing. Remember, no sirens, no spotlights, and no communication with the house staff until the interior is secure. The convoy slowed to a crawl, the engines purring with a low, menacing hum as the vehicles lined up along the shoulder of Route 3A, their tires sinking softly into the frozen slush of the coastal pines. The towering granite walls of St. Jude's Haven loomed out of the fog like the hull of a shipwrecked galleon, the massive iron gates shut tight against the freezing wind. The tactical operators deployed from the rear doors of the utility vans with mechanical precision, their black ballistic gear slick with ice, their weapons held at the low ready as they prepared to snap the trap shut on the man who had spent his entire adult life believing the church's sanctuary would protect him from the blood on his hands. Silas Thorne stepped out of the vehicle, his boots crunching softly on the frozen gravel as he guided the breach team toward the gate's electronic control box. The midnight air was thick with the scent of sea salt, decaying pine needles, and the cold, metallic tang of the coastal storm, the exact atmospheric elements that had accompanied the death of Maggie Sullivan in 1974. The Wheel of Justice had taken 52 years to complete its rotation, but as the tactical technician connected the override cable to the gate's electronic matrix, the long, freezing silence of South Boston's most notorious cold case was finally, violently coming to an end. The high-security electronic override of the Cohasset Gate took exactly 24 seconds, a duration that felt like an eternity to the men huddled in the freezing darkness of Route 3A. There was no theatrical spark or loud snap when the technician bypassed the circuit. Instead, the heavy, rusted iron gates of St. Jude's Haven let out a low, hydraulic sigh, swinging slowly inward like the jaws of a prehistoric beast awakening from a long, subterranean slumber. The headlights of the 4 unmarked black utility vehicles remained dark, their parking lights casting a faint, amber glow across the frost-encrusted gravel of the winding driveway. The tactical operators moved past the stone pillars on foot, their black ballistic fabric rustling softly against the frozen winter brush, their heavy boots making no sound on the slush-covered path. The fog rolling off the Atlantic was incredibly thick, a wet, freezing blanket that clung to their visors and muffled the low, persistent rumble of the surf crashing against the jagged granite cliffs 80 feet below. Inside the trailing command unit, Thomas Burns stared at his monitoring screen, his thumb pressed against the recording trigger of his digital field unit. The audio feed from Detective Silas Thorne's lapel microphone was a steady, rhythmic pattern of pressurized breathing, the rustle of tactical nylon, and the occasional, sharp whistle of the coastal wind cutting through the ancient pine trees. Behind them, the city of Boston was still sleeping, entirely unaware that the digital architecture of a true crime podcast had bypassed 52 years of political, judicial, and ecclesiastical containment to trap a legendary phantom in his own sanctuary. St. Jude's Haven loomed out of the gray mist like a medieval fortress, its dark, Gothic-style granite blocks glistening with ice, its high, narrow windows completely dark except for a single, amber light flickering on the second floor of the West Wing. This was the Sanctuary of the Forgotten, a highly secure, church-owned facility where the diocesan hierarchy had quietly routed its most sensitive and compromised assets for over half a century. To the residents of Cohasset, it was simply an exclusive, quiet home for retired clergy, a place where elderly priests lived out their remaining days in peaceful prayer and contemplation. But to the detectives of Area C6, it was a black hole, a dead-end terminal where the paper trails of decades of unsolved institutional inquiries simply vanished into the sea spray. The men who lived inside these stone walls were protected by a sophisticated network of private security, legal insulation, and the deep, communal self-preservation of an institution that viewed secular law as a secondary authority. Tactical team is at the main carriage porch. Thorne's voice whispered through the radio speaker, his breath blooming in the freezing air of the earpiece. The exterior doors are heavy oak reinforced with interior steel strapwork. We are skipping the hydraulic breach to avoid triggering the building's internal fire alarm. We're using the secondary master key retrieved from the archdiocesan facility logs. The key turned in the massive brass lock with a heavy, metallic clink that seemed to echo through the empty, high-ceilinged entrance hall. The breach team filtered through the opening in a single, fluid line, their tactical flashlights cutting narrow, dusty beams through the darkness of the interior. The air inside the manor was incredibly still, smelling of old paper, institutional floor wax, heavy winter linen, and the faint, lingering trace of pharmaceutical antiseptic. There were no sounds of life, no television screens, no coughing, no soft footsteps of nighttime nurses. It was a tomb of absolute, enforced silence, a place designed to keep the world out and the secrets in. As they navigated the wide, carpeted corridors of the West Wing, the tactical operators passed doors marked with simple, brass nameplates, each one representing a name that had once commanded immense authority in the parishes of Boston, now reduced to a silent registry of the elderly and the infirm. The walls were lined with dark, oil portraits of long-dead bishops, their painted eyes tracking the black-clad figures of the state police as they moved toward room 204. The grandfather clock in the central gallery let out a deep, resonant chime for 12:15 a.m., the sound vibrating through the wooden floorboards like a low-frequency warning. When Thorne reached the door of room 204, he did not hesitate. He did not knock, nor did he announce his presence. He turned the brass handle, the latch clicking open smoothly, and stepped into the room with his service weapon drawn, his tactical flashlight illuminating the interior with a blinding, high-intensity beam. Father John Logan was not in bed. He was not asleep. The 81-year-old priest sat in a high-backed leather armchair position directly in front of the large, arched window, his gaze fixed on the churning, black void of the Atlantic Ocean. He was dressed in a clean, black cassock, his Roman collar perfectly in place, his frail, spotted hands resting flat on the wooden armrests of his chair. His face was a map of deep, parchment-like wrinkles, his thin, silver hair brushed back from his high forehead, but his eyes, pale, watery gray, and incredibly sharp, did not flinch against the sudden, piercing glare of the police lights. He looked entirely prepared, as if he had been sitting in that exact chair, watching the coastal fog roll in, waiting for this specific knock on his door for 52 years. "You've taken a very long path to Cohasset, Detective," Logan said, his voice surprisingly firm, a low, resonant baritone that carried the precise, theatrical cadence of a man who had spent his youth delivering sermons from the high marble pulpits of South Boston. He did not raise his hands, nor did he make any movement to resist. "I thought the department had forgotten how to read the registry books." "The department didn't find you, John," Thorne said, his voice cold, steady, and carrying the immense, crushing weight of a career spent chasing ghosts. "A young woman named Maggie Sullivan found you. She's been waiting in the shadow of the altar for 52 years for you to finish your confession." A faint, chilling smile touched the corners of Logan's thin lips, a movement of his skin so slight it looked like a crack appearing in old porcelain. He slowly turned his head to look at Thomas Byrne, who had stepped into the room behind the detective, his digital recorder held at the ready, its red recording light blinking in the low light like a miniature, rhythmic heartbeat. "You are the boy from the podcast," Logan said, his gray eyes narrowing as he analyzed the young journalist's face. "The one with the loud voice and the collection of old postcards. You think you have brought the truth into the light, but you have only opened a door that you do not have the strength to close. You are a tourist in the sanctuary, young man. You do not understand the architecture of the house." "I understand the architecture of the basement, Father," Thomas said, his voice tight with adrenaline, his finger pressing firmer against the recorder. "I understand the Berkshire Chapel. I understand the Iron Gull, Inc. And I understand the silver rosary you left in Maggie's hand to send a message to the bishop's office." "We found a locker, John." Thorne cut in, stepping between Logan and the window. He pulled a high-resolution photograph from his tactical folder and laid it flat on the small, wooden desk beside the priest's chair. It was the image of the vintage silver rosary, the hand-engraved Latin phrase reflecting the harsh flash of the forensic camera, "Quicquid sub terra est in lusum proferit." Our toolmark examiners ran a comparative analysis on the engraving scribes recovered from your Berkshire office. It's an absolute, mechanical match. The tool that carved those words was sitting in your personal writing desk for 50 years. You didn't just kill her. You signed the weapon. Logan's gaze drifted slowly to the photograph, his pale eyes showing no trace of fear or regret, but rather a deep, clinical appreciation for the forensic reality before him. "The rosary was not a weapon, Detective," he whispered, his voice dropping to a low, rhythmic murmur that filled the quiet room like a Latin prayer. "It was an instrument of reconciliation. It was the ticket for her transit. Maggie was a very beautiful, very intelligent girl, but she was reckless. She did not understand that the parish is not a charity. It is a system of survival. She wanted to open the vault. She wanted to expose the transaction logs of the property transfers that kept the diocese from bankruptcy during the post-war decline. She was going to destroy the very home that fed her." "So you killed her," Thorne said, his hand tightening on his weapon. "You cornered her in the sacristy. You used your position to gain her trust, and you suffocated her with a wet linen from the altar." "I gave her a sanctuary," Logan replied, his voice rising slightly, carrying a chilling, absolute self-righteousness that sent a shiver down Thomas's spine. "She was going to bring the federal inspectors into our house. She was going to let the secular courts tear down the institutions that kept South Boston alive. I did what my vows required me to do. I protected the seal. I protected the mother. I placed her in the shadow of the cross, and I wrote her name in the permanent register. That is not murder, Detective. That is administration. Get the cuffs on him. Thorne signaled to the tactical operators. As the heavy, matte black steel handcuffs clicked tightly around the old priest's frail wrists, the tactical team began a systematic, room-by-room search of the private quarters. It was a space defined by a severe, aesthetic minimalism, a single bed, a wooden crucifix mounted on the plaster wall, and a bookcase filled with ancient, leather-bound theological texts. But as a forensic technician ran a high-intensity ultraviolet scanner along the baseboards of the built-in oak wardrobe, a distinct, yellow-green fluorescence flared beneath the floorboards. "Thorne, we've got a void under the cedar panel," the technician called out, his voice sharp with a sudden, electrifying discovery. Using a specialized pry bar, the technician lifted the heavy, tongue-in-groove cedar board, revealing a small, zinc-lined cavity built directly into the joists of the old manor floor. Resting inside the dry, dark space was a single, dusty object, a vintage, leather-bound personal diary with the initials MS stamped in fading gold foil on the cover. Maggie Sullivan's missing journal, the critical piece of evidence that the original 1974 task force had searched for in vain, had been sitting beneath John Logan's feet for 52 years, a silent, locked witness to the secrets of St. Jude's Parish. Logan did not watch them retrieve the diary. His eyes remained fixed on the dark, misty window, his lips moving silently in a low, rapid sequence of Latin prayers as the federal marshals lifted him from his chair. The myth of the saintly, traumatized curate was dead, replaced by the clinical, terrifying reality of an institutional predator who had used his collar as a license to silence. The midnight arrest at the Cohasset retirement home was complete. The first brick in the 50-year cover-up had been violently dislodged, and the final, devastating chapter of Boston's most notorious cold case was officially underway. The heavy, zinc-lined box containing Maggie Sullivan's leather-bound diary did not just represent a breakthrough in a 52-year-old homicide. It was a payload of radioactive truth dropped directly into the center of Boston's established order. As the convoy of black utility vehicles carved its way back north through the blinding, freezing coastal fog of Route 3A, the silence inside the trailing command unit was heavy, charged with the nervous energy of an impending structural collapse. In the back seat, Thomas Byrne held the digital audio interface steady, his eyes tracking the audio wave levels of the raw recording he had just captured in the cold room of room 204. Beside him, Detective Silas Thorne stared out the window into the gray, swirling New England mist, his knuckles white against the steering wheel, his mind racing through the legal and political landmines that were already beginning to detonate across the city of Boston. The drive back to the Area C, 6 Precinct House was an exercise in pure tension, the headlights of the police cruisers barely piercing the thick, icy shroud rolling off the Atlantic. By 1:15 a.m., the first media vans had already begun to gather outside the brick gates of the Cohasset estate, tipped off by the sudden, massive disruption in the electronic security grid of St. Jude's Haven. But the press was already miles behind the narrative. The live digital transmission of the parish secrets had bypassed the traditional newsrooms completely, broadcasting Father John Logan's chilling, self-righteous defense of the 1974 sanctuary execution directly to the devices of 4 million listeners. The administrative walls that had protected the curate for more than half a century had not just cracked, they had been vaporized by a decentralized digital network that did not answer to the district attorney, the police commissioner, or the archdiocesan chancellors. When the convoy finally rolled into the secure sally port of Area C-6, the atmosphere was chaotic, a frantic scramble of tactical officers, forensic specialists, and assistant district attorneys who had been dragged out of bed by the midnight emergency. The basement of the precinct house, usually a quiet, fluorescent-lit corridor of filing cabinets and legacy evidence lockers, was transformed into an active federal command center. Armed state troopers stood at every stairwell, their faces grim, their orders absolute. No one, under any circumstances, was to enter or leave the building without direct authorization from the state attorney general's office. Inside the secure forensic processing room, the atmosphere was sterile, smelling of ozone, latex gloves, and the sharp, chemical scent of the vacuum chamber. Sarah Byrne, Her face pale beneath her protective visor, carefully placed Maggie Sullivan's diary under the lens of the high-definition multispectral scanner. The leather cover, once a vibrant, rich burgundy, was now a faded, water-damaged gray. The gold foil initials MS oxidized into a dull, green crust. Yet, as the scanner's ultraviolet lights flared, the microscopic layers of the paper fibers beneath the cover began to resolve, revealing the elegant, flowing handwriting of a 19-year-old girl who had spent her final weeks living in the shadow of an impending execution. "The binding is completely intact, Silas," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper that was captured by the studio microphones. The zinc lining of the floor cavity kept the moisture from destroying the ink. "It's an organic iron gall ink, similar to the formula used on the parish registers in the early 70s. But look at the margins. This wasn't a personal journal of teenage thoughts. Maggie wasn't writing about her friends or her dreams. She was cataloging a ledger." Thomas leaned closer to the monitor, his camera lens capturing the glowing, blue-tinted lines of the digital scan as they materialized on the screen. The entries, dated from August to November of 1974, were a precise, chronological map of a massive, systematic financial conspiracy that touched the very foundations of South Boston's development boom. Maggie Sullivan, in her role as the parish volunteer and register keeper, had discovered that the St. Jude's parish accounts were being used as a massive, offshore clearinghouse for unrecorded real estate transactions. Listen to this entry from October 14, 1974, Thomas said, his voice carrying a cold, cinematic resonance that filled the quiet of the laboratory. He read directly from the translated text on the screen. "Father Logan brought 3 new land deeds to the rectory office tonight. They aren't in the parish directory. They belong to the old waterfront warehouse parcels near the Commonwealth Pier, land that was supposed to be zoned for public housing and veterans memorials. But the signatures on the transfers don't belong to the city inspectors. They belong to a private development firm called Atlantic Logistics." When I asked him why the parish was receiving monthly wire transfers from a bank in Nassau, he told me that the church's charity required discreet administration. He took the ledger keys from my desk before he left. "I think he's watching the apartment." Atlantic Logistics wasn't a development firm, Silas Thorne said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, dangerous pitch that cut through the low-frequency hum of the scanners. It was a shell company operated by the Winter Hill Gang's financial operators in the 70s. They were using the church's tax-exempt status to wash millions of dollars in union kickbacks, protection money, and illegal waterfront cargo fees. The parish wasn't just a house of worship. It was a private laundry machine for the most violent criminal syndicate in New England history. And John Logan was the one who held the soap. The geopolitical scale of the conspiracy was staggering. In the mid-70s, the city of Boston was undergoing a painful, violent transition, torn apart by the desegregation busing crisis and the rapid decline of its industrial shipping corridors. The local Catholic parishes were the only stable, trusted institutions left in the working-class neighborhoods, acting as the social, political, and financial anchors for hundreds of thousands of families. If a federal grand jury had audited the books of St. Jude's in 1974, the resulting scandal would not just have ruined the local diocese, it would have triggered a systemic, violent collapse of the city's political alliances, exposing the corrupt connections between the police department, the state house, and the organized crime figures who controlled the docks. "She was 19 years old," Thomas said, his hand tightening on his camera grip, his chest rising and falling with a deep, emotional anger. "She was trying to do the right thing for her neighborhood. She saw her church being used to fund the very people who were poisoning her streets with heroin and extortion, and she thought she could stop it by showing the registers to a federal investigator. She didn't know that the priest who heard her confession on Saturday mornings was the one who had signed the execution order." "Look at the entry from November 11, 1974, Sarah said, her finger tracing a line on the touchscreen. "The night before her death." The handwriting on the scanned page was frantic, the letters larger, more erratic, the ink drag showing the physical tremor of a young woman who knew the net was closing around her. "I found the key to the lower sacristy cabinet," the entry read, the words glowing with a bright, neon blue intensity under the ultraviolet scanner. There are no vestments inside. There are 3 steel trunks filled with cash, old property deeds from the 1950s, and a collection of tarnished silver rosaries that belong to the old security division. I took one of the rosaries to prove what they've been hiding down there. Logan saw me leaving the side door. He didn't say anything but his eyes. He looked at me as if I were already dead. I'm going to meet the federal marshal at the Commonwealth Pier warehouse at 6 a.m. tomorrow. I have to get the diary out of the city. If I don't make it, the truth is under the floor. She was going to the Maritime warehouse, Thorne said, standing up and reaching for his tactical jacket. The old Atlantic Logistics terminal on the South Boston waterfront. That's where the handoff was supposed to happen. But she never made it to the pier. Logan intercepted her in the sanctuary at 6 a.m. before the first mass, took the diary from her backpack, and staged her body at the altar to send a message to anyone else who thought about breaking the seal. But he didn't destroy the diary, Silas, Thomas said, his eyes locking onto the veteran detectives. Why would he keep the one piece of physical evidence that could send him to the electric chair for 50 years? Because it was his insurance policy, Thorne explained, his face turning into a hard, unforgiving mask of stone. The Winter Hill operators and the corrupt politicians who paid Logan's protection fees didn't trust him any more than he trusted them. The diary was his leverage. As long as he had Maggie's journal locked in his vault, he could prove to his partners that he had the names of everyone who had signed those offshore transfers. If they tried to cut him loose, or if a new police commissioner decided to play hero, Logan could drop that diary on a federal prosecutor's desk and bring the entire state house down with him. He didn't keep it out of remorse. He kept it to protect his crown. The phone on the forensic table suddenly rang, its loud, sharp tone echoing off the concrete walls of the lab like a physical blow. Silas Thorne picked it up, his face tightening as he listened to the voice on the other end of the line. "The state attorney general is entering the building," Thorne said, slamming the receiver back down. He's got a team of diocesan lawyers with him, and they've got a federal injunction to seal all physical evidence recovered from the Cohasset estate, claiming it falls under ecclesiastical privilege and the sealing of private archives. They're going to try to lock this diary in a vault before the grand jury can even see the scans. "They're too late," Thomas Burns said, a cold, triumphant smile breaking through his exhaustion. He tapped the touch screen of his laptop, showing the active upload progress bar on his podcast network server. The multispectral scans, the decrypted entries, and the raw audio of Logan's confession have already been mirrored to 3 independent, offshore servers in Switzerland and Iceland. The episode is scheduled to go live to our subscribers in exactly 4 minutes. They can lock the paper in their vaults, Silas, but they can't lock up the internet. As the heavy footsteps of the state officials echoed down the concrete corridor of Area C6, Thomas Byrne turned his camera back toward the high-definition monitor, where the image of Maggie Sullivan's 52-year-old handwriting sat bathed in the clear, sharp light of the digital era. The old guard's protective circle had finally been broken. The walls of St. Jude's Haven had collapsed under the weight of the truth, and the long, freezing winter of South Boston's most notorious cold case was finally, beautifully transitioning into a permanent, blinding light. The heavy oak doors of the Area C6 precinct locker room did not just rattle under the weight of the arriving state officials. They marked the beginning of a high-velocity legal showdown that would pit the decaying infrastructure of Boston's old guard against the unstoppable, decentralized power of the digital age. By 1:42 a.m. on that freezing November morning, the concrete corridors of the South Boston Station House were thick with the tension of an impending institutional collapse. Outside, the freezing rain had turned into a blinding, ice-slicked New England sleet, coating the blue and red strobe lights of the parked cruisers in a hard, mirror-like glaze. But inside the forensic processing unit, the air was hot, smelling of ozone, stale coffee, and the sharp, chemical tang of the vacuum chamber, where Maggie Sullivan's 52-year-old diary lay bathed in the purple glow of the multispectral scanner. State Attorney General Richard Devlin stepped into the room, flanked by 2 senior diocesan attorneys in tailored dark overcoats and a pair of armed state police captains. Devlin's face was a mask of calculated, bureaucratic authority, the face of a politician who had spent 30 years navigating the complex, interlocking circles of the state senate, the local judiciary, and the powerful parish networks that had historically decided the fate of every election in Suffolk County. He did not look at the high-definition monitors displaying the glowing, blue-tinted scans of Maggie's handwriting. His eyes locked directly onto Detective Silas Thorne, his hand reaching into his leather briefcase to pull out a crisp, white document bearing the blue embossed seal of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. "Thorne, you are to step away from the scanning console immediately," Devlin said, his voice carrying a flat, practiced clinical authority that had silenced 100 courtroom disputes. "I have a signed, emergency protective order issued by Justice Harrington. All physical materials, digital imaging files, and biological samples recovered from the Cohasset estate are officially sealed under the provisions of Ecclesiastical Archive confidentiality and the state privacy statutes. You are to turn over that leather-bound volume and all local storage drives to the custody of the court's designated receiver. Now." One of the diocesan attorneys stepped forward, holding open a sterile, zinc-lined evidence case, his gloved hands ready to sweep the diary back into the dark. But Silas Thorne did not move. He stood with his back to the scanner, his heavy hands resting on the edge of the metal table, his shadow completely enveloping the glowing monitor. "The warrant that got us into room 204 was signed by a federal magistrate, Richard," Thorne said, his gravelly voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that cut through the hum of the ventilation fans like an iron file. "It was a federal civil rights color of law execution warrant. Your state judge doesn't have the jurisdiction to seal a paper clip in this room, let alone the personal diary of a 19-year-old murder victim. That book is active evidence in a multi-jurisdictional capital homicide case, and it's not leaving this precinct until the federal grand jury has finished reading every single word. We are talking about the structural stability of this entire city, Silas," Devlin hissed, stepping closer, his clinical facade cracking to reveal the raw, desperate panic of a man who knew his own name was likely written in the margins of those faded pages. "If you publish those scan ledgers, if you tie the local parishes to the offshore accounts of the Winter Hill financial operators from the 70s, you won't just ruin a few retired priests. You will freeze the commercial development of the entire South Boston waterfront. Every title deed, every maritime warehouse permit, and every municipal construction contract signed in the last 40 years will be tied up in federal litigation for a generation. The banks will pull their capital, the union pension funds will be frozen, and this neighborhood will collapse back into the economic wasteland it was in 1974. Then let it collapse." Thomas Burns' voice cut through the administrative posturing from the corner of the room. He stepped forward, holding up his active smartphone, the screen displaying a rapid, vertical scroll of green data blocks, the live download statistics for the emergency episode of The Parish Secrets. "You're still playing by the rules of the old print rooms, Mr. Attorney General. You think if you can control the paper, you can control the truth. But we aren't waiting for the morning edition of the Globe." The multispectral scans of Maggie's journal, along with the raw audio of John Logan's confession, were mirrored to 3 independent, secure cloud servers in Reykjavik and Zurich 10 minutes ago. The episode went live to our 4 million subscribers while you were still arguing with the gatekeeper at our front door. The diocesan attorney's hand froze over the zinc-lined case, his face turning an icy, bloodless white as he looked at the phone screen. The digital dragnet had bypassed their legal injunctions with absolute, humiliating efficiency. The private, decades-old transaction logs that had protected the political alliances of the city were no longer a protected institutional secret. They were a public, decentralized archive that was currently being downloaded, analyzed, and crowdsourced by millions of eyes across the globe. "You've committed a federal Class A misdemeanor, young man," Devlin said, his eyes narrowing into 2 slivers of cold, calculating steel as he glared at Thomas. "You have compromised an active grand jury investigation. I can have you in a federal holding cell before the sun clears the harbor. Then you'll have to explain to those 4 million listeners why the state attorney general's office is arresting the journalist who solved the Maggie Sullivan case, while the priest who suffocated her is sitting in a private, heated suite at a church-owned retreat. Thomas replied, his voice rock-steady, his lens capturing every micro-expression of the politician's face. The world is watching this room, Richard. And they're starting to ask why you're so eager to keep the warehouse records in the dark. The mention of the warehouse caused a sudden, sharp stillness to fall over the room. Silas Thorne reached over to his desk, picking up a high-resolution, black-and-white aerial photograph from 1974. It depicted a massive, dilapidated timber and iron structure perched on the desolate, wind-swept edge of Commonwealth Pier, the old Atlantic Logistics maritime warehouse where Maggie Sullivan had planned to meet her federal marshal contact at 6 a.m. on the morning of her death. According to the entry from November 11, 1974, Thorne said, tapping his finger against the image of the rusted warehouse roof, Maggie didn't just take the silver rosary from the lower sacristy cabinet. She found a secondary set of keys to the private storage vaults inside this terminal. She wrote that there were 3 steel trunks hidden in the lower office, trunks filled with cash, property deeds, and the original, unredacted security logs of the Waterfront Division from the 1950s. Logan didn't just kill her to keep her from talking. He did it to stop her from delivering those keys to the federal authorities. That warehouse was demolished 20 years ago, Thorne, Devlin said, his voice carrying a desperate, defensive edge. It's a parking structure now. There's nothing down there but asphalt and concrete piles. The superstructure was demolished, Richard. Sarah Byrne corrected him, turning her monitor to display a 3-dimensional geological survey map of the modern waterfront. But the subterranean foundations, the old timber and granite sea vaults built into the seawall during the 19th century, were never removed. They were simply capped with a 6-inch layer of reinforced industrial concrete to support the weight of the modern parking deck. The vaults are still there, completely intact and completely insulated from the tides by the old masonry seals. She zoomed in on a specific, shaded coordinate near the eastern edge of the pier, where a narrow, subterranean void was clearly visible beneath the concrete layer. And according to the city's utility logs, the electricity to those lower vaults was never completely cut. Someone has been quietly paying the minimum localized maintenance fees for the underground dry pumps at that coordinate for 52 years. The payments were made in cash, delivered via money orders tracking back to a currency exchange in South Boston, the exact same currency exchange used to fund John Logan's private accounts at St. Jude's Haven. The trap had not just closed around the old priest in his Cohasset retreat. It had mapped a physical, subterranean archive of corruption that lay directly beneath the modern, glass and steel playground of the new Boston waterfront. Silas Thorne grabbed his heavy leather police coat, his eyes locking onto the tactical radio unit on his belt. "Get the active-duty SWAT stack on the line," he commanded the dispatcher. "Tell them we are moving on the Commonwealth Pier parking structure. I want a complete perimeter seal, Marine units from the Coast Guard to secure the water face, and 2 state police units to block the street entrances. We're going to cut the concrete tonight." As the tactical team scrambled toward the Sally Port, the sound of their heavy boots echoing through the brick corridors, Thomas Burns stepped out into the freezing New England night, his digital field recorder held high to capture the rising hum of the city's awakening anger. The rain had stopped, but the wind off the harbor was wild, a howling, icy force that seemed to carry the long-forgotten whispers of the girl who had tried to save her neighborhood from the shadows of the altar. The long, freezing winter of 1974 was finally, violently coming to an end. The red tacks were being pulled from the historical map, and the city of Boston was about to face the blinding, unyielding light of its own unburied past. The tactical convoy of unmarked utility units did not utilize sirens as they carved through the freezing ice-slicked expanse of the South Boston waterfront, but the heavy, low-frequency hum of their diesel engines carried the undeniable weight of an institutional execution. It was exactly 2:12 a.m. when the lead black utility van cut its parking lights, sliding to a halt across the slick asphalt of the Commonwealth Pier parking structure. The wind blowing off Boston Harbor was an absolute, punishing force, carrying a freezing sea spray that instantly crystallized into a hard, glossy sheath over the tactical helmets and ballistic vests of the arriving Area C-6 SWAT stack. The entire perimeter was transforming into a high-security lockbox in real time. 2 high-speed interceptor craft from the Coast Guard cut their engines in the black water of the shipping channel, their thermal imaging arrays casting narrow, invisible sweeps across the granite seawall, while state police cruisers sealed the street-level entrance ramps against the early morning delivery trucks. Detective Silas Thorne stepped out of the lead vehicle, his heavy leather police coat instantly slicked with sleet, his eyes fixed on the precise architectural markers of the modern parking deck. To the casual observer, this structure was merely a gray, utilitarian slab of modern infrastructure supporting the glass and steel commercial playground of the new waterfront. But Thorne wasn't looking at the modern shell. Armed with the 1974 Atlantic Logistics blueprints and the multispectral data generated by Sarah Burns' laboratory scanners, he could see the invisible, historic geometry of the timber and iron maritime warehouse that had once defined the pier. The modern builders had not removed the massive, low-lying granite sea vaults that anchored the seawall. They had simply poured a 6-inch cap of reinforced industrial concrete over the historical masonry, sealing half a century of corruption directly beneath the parking spaces. Breach team is in stack position at Section 4 Blue. Captain Miller's voice crackled through the tactical earpieces, his tone flat, disciplined, and stripped of all emotional filler. The ground-penetrating radar confirms the upper concrete cap is exactly 6.5 inches thick at this coordinate, resting directly on top of the original 19th century oak timber framing. The dry pump cavity is directly below us. If the pump has failed, the vault will be flooded to the ceiling with harbor water. If the pump is still running, we're stepping into a dry room from 1974. Thomas Burns stepped out of the rear of the command unit, his hand rock steady on the dual-grip housing of his digital cinematic camera. The small, red recording light blinked in the darkness, a tiny, rhythmic pulse of accountability that was currently broadcasting the physical descent to over 4 million digital listeners. There was no studio script, no post-production editing, and no artificial dramatic framing. The raw, dawn-dap cadence of the operation was dictated entirely by the high-velocity scream of the diamond-tipped concrete saws as they slammed into the reinforced deck. The sound was a deafening, metallic screech that tore through the freezing harbor air, sending a thick, white cloud of pulverized limestone and concrete dust billowing into the beams of the portable LED work lights. The tactical operators stood in a tight, defensive ring around the saw operators, their hands resting on their submachine guns, their eyes tracking the empty perimeter of the pier. The tension was an absolute, physical presence. They knew that the political hierarchy of the city was currently scrambling to secure a secondary administrative stay from the federal courts, and every second spent cutting the deck was a second stolen from the old guard's fading window of containment. With a deep, hollow thud that vibrated through the soles of their boots, the rectangular slab of concrete finally gave way, dropping 2 inches onto the reinforced safety netting suspended below. The saw operators instantly cut the power, the mechanical scream winding down into a low, rattling hum, leaving only the sound of the wild harbor wind howling through the iron railings. The breach team moved forward with heavy crowbars, pivoting the massive concrete block upward and out of the aperture, exposing a dark, narrow geometric void that dropped vertically into the subterranean blackness of the old seawall. Thorne leaned over the opening, his high-powered tactical flashlight cutting a sharp, dusty beam through the rising mist. The air that exhaled from the shaft was thick, freezing, and heavily saturated with the scent of ancient river mud, rotted pine timbers, and a sharp, unmistakable olfactory signature that made Thomas Burns' chest tighten. The heavy, oily scent of mid-century industrial grease mixed with the clean, sweet aroma of hot beeswax. It was the exact environmental profile recovered from the filigree of the Silver Rosary in room 204. The subterranean dry pumps had done their job. For 52 years, the vault had remained sealed, insulated from the shifting tides of the Atlantic, holding its breath in the absolute dark. "The ladder is clear," Thorne announced, his voice flat and unyielding as he swung his leg over the lip of the cut deck. "Breach stack moves in single file. Total light containment. Keep your weapons at the low ready. The timber framing down here is over a century old, and the footing is going to be slick with low-level condensation." The descent into the sea vault felt like stepping backward through the geological layers of Boston's industrial history. As Thomas Byrne followed Thorne down the rusted iron rungs of the maintenance ladder, the modern concrete ceiling vanished from view, replaced by massive, rough-hewn beams of old-growth Georgia pine that were completely black with legacy coal soot. The walls were constructed of giant blocks of Quincy granite, locked together by sheer weight and sealed with a crumbling mortar that had dried into white streaks down the masonry. The floor was a solid expanse of packed, dark river gravel, completely dry except for a thin film of moisture that glinted in the beams of their tactical lights. At the eastern end of the vault, sitting adjacent to a massive, cast-iron check valve that controlled the harbor drainage line, was a small, brick-walled office enclosure, the old administrative core of the Atlantic Logistics Terminal. The heavy oak door had completely rotted away from its iron hinges, its timber fragments lying on the gravel floor like ancient bones. Inside the office, resting on a rusted metal desk that had been bolted directly to the granite wall, were the physical remnants of the night Maggie Sullivan was executed. A half-empty bottle of local rye whiskey sat next to a white ceramic ash tray containing the calcified remains of 3 cigars. Beside the ash tray lay a vintage, mechanical stamp machine used to log the arrival of waterfront cargo manifests, its internal calendar wheels permanently frozen at November 12, 1974. But it was the space beneath the metal desk that drew the immediate, silent focus of every tactical light in the room. Resting side by side on the gravel floor were 3 massive, heavy steel trunks, their surfaces coated in a thick, defensive layer of dark cosmoline grease that had protected the metal from rust for over half a century. The lids were secured by high-security brass padlocks bearing the embossed emblem of the Illinois Central Railroad Security Division, the exact legacy transit enforcement unit that Father John Logan's father had operated during the mid-century labor disputes. Thorne knelt in the gravel, his gloved fingers brushing the grease off the top latch of the primary trunk. "This isn't church property, and it isn't municipal archive material," he said, his voice echoing softly off the granite blocks. "This is the operational infrastructure of a shadow syndicate. Captain Miller, get the hydraulic bolt cutters down here. It's time to open the books." The heavy brass lock snapped with a sharp, explosive pop that sounded like a gunshot in the confined space of the vault. Thorne gripped the handles of the steel lid, lifting it upward with a slow, heavy groan of the hinges. The interior of the first trunk was an absolute portrait of systematic corruption. Arranged in pristine, vertical rows were dozens of heavy, canvas bank bags stamped with the logo of the Nassau National Bank of the Bahamas. Tucked between the bags were stacks of crisp, uncirculated $100 bills from the 1969 series, their paper bands still unbroken, totaling millions of dollars in untraceable, washed currency. But the true devastation lay in the secondary compartment of the trunk, a built-in leather filing rack containing a sequence of 23 pristine, blue-covered property deeds. Thomas Byrne lowered his camera until the lens was inches from the top deed, the glowing text resolving on the digital screens of millions of viewers worldwide. The document was an official land transfer for the very parcel of Commonwealth Pier they were currently standing under. The signature on the grantor line belonged to the Archdiocesan Chancellor from 1974. The signature on the grantee line belonged to a shell corporation controlled by the executioner himself, Father John Logan. The transaction logs were complete. The silver rosary left in Maggie Sullivan's hand had not been a random religious artifact. It was the physical key to this subterranean vault, a silent, unyielding witness that had waited 52 years in the dark just to prove that the sanctuary of the altar had been used as a clearinghouse for the blood money of the city. The concrete cap had been breached, the lockers had been opened, and the final, beautiful collapse of Boston's old guard was officially, irreversibly underway in the blinding light of the digital dawn. The structural seal of the first steel trunk had not just been broken by the hydraulic cutters, it had unleashed a forensic flood of evidence that was already routing itself through the fiber-optic cables of the world's digital infrastructure. Under the harsh, glaring beams of the portable LED work lights suspended from the century-old Georgia pine beams, the dust-choked air of the sea vault grew thick with the scent of oxidized brass, deteriorating paper currency, and the sharp, chemical tang of the cosmoline grease that had kept the contents pristine. Silas Thorne stood in the damp gravel of the floor, his breathing slow and heavy, his handheld flashlight tracing the neat, vertical rows of canvas bank bags from the Bahamas. Every bag was a physical monument to a transaction that had been written in the blood of South Boston's working class, and every deed inside the leather filing rack was a link in a chain that led directly from the altar of St. Jude's to the high-rise corporate offices of the modern waterfront. Behind him, Thomas Byrne kept his cinematic camera locked on the primary trunk, the red recording light casting a faint, rhythmic crimson pulse against the rough-hewn Quincy granite blocks of the seawall. The live audio feed was captured with perfect, unedited fidelity, transmitting the wet, rhythmic slap of the harbor tides against the exterior masonry directly to the headphones of over 5 million listeners. The digital audience was no longer just consuming a true crime narrative. They were active witnesses to an ongoing, real-time archaeological excavation of municipal rot. The old guard's final defensive lines had been completely bypassed, and the secondary legal injunctions the state attorney general was desperately trying to secure from the appellate court were becoming irrelevant with every document Thomas displayed on the live stream. The paper quality of these deeds is remarkably high for the period. Sarah Byrne's voice crackled through the tactical intercom from her workstation back at the Area C, 6th Precinct. She had just received the first high-resolution optical scans of the Bahamas transactions. It's a heavyweight bond paper, custom-manufactured with a localized watermark depicting the old seal of the Boston Port Authority. This wasn't standard corporate stationery, Silas. These forms were printed inside the municipal printing office itself. The people who authorized these land transfers didn't just look the other way. They used the city's own physical presses to generate the counterfeit titles. Silas Thorne reached into the second compartment of the trunk, his gloved fingers bypassing the stacks of uncirculated currency to pull out a thick, leather-bound ledger book. The cover was constructed of heavy, oil-resistant black vinyl, its corners reinforced with tarnished brass caps, and its spine stamped with the letters ALD, Atlantic Logistics Division. When he opened the first page, the elegant, flowing script of the parish registers appeared under his light, written in the unmistakable, dark blue iron gall ink of Father John Logan. It was not a religious journal. It was a systematic, unredacted registry of corruption. The columns were arranged with the clinical discipline of an industrial auditor: date, voucher number, offshore transit route, and, most devastatingly, the legal names of the individuals who had received the cash disbursements. The entries stretched from the spring of 1971 to the winter of 1979, bridging the gap between the height of the desegregation busing crisis and the massive, multi-million-dollar redevelopment projects that had transformed the South Boston shipping terminals. "Look at the names, Thomas," Thorne whispered, his gravelly voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency that made the digital meters on the camera screen spike into the yellow. He turned his flashlight beam to the page dated November 12, 1974, the morning Maggie Sullivan's body was staged at the altar of St. Jude's. These aren't local street bosses or warehouse workers. The first entry for that morning is a $50,000 cash transfer to the personal campaign account of former state Senator Francis X. Harrington. The second is a $25,000 payout to the chief of the Suffolk County Sheriff's Department. And the third is a signed receipt for $10,000 marked for discrete operational services at the Commonwealth Pier Terminal, signed by the lead homicide investigator who was assigned to Maggie's case that afternoon. The revelation went through the digital feed like a high-voltage current. The entire structural investigation into the murder of Maggie Sullivan had been a performance, a carefully staged theatrical production directed by the very men who had been paid to protect the city's streets. The lead detective had not missed the footprints in the wet gravel on that cold morning in 1974 because of professional incompetence. He had ignored them because his signature was already drying on a $20,000 payment voucher inside the Sea Vault. While the forensic team began the systematic, itemized cataloging of the first trunk, Silas Thorne moved toward the second steel box, his boots crunching loudly on the wet river gravel. The lock on this container was different. a high-security mechanical dial lock manufactured by the Yale and Town Company in the early 50s, its heavy steel wheel seized into a solid lump of white corrosion. "We don't have the combination for this one, Silas," Captain Miller said, his hand resting on the heavy, battery-powered hydraulic spreader tool. "The concrete saw won't cut this alloy without generating high-intensity sparks, and the air down here is still too thick with legacy coal dust to risk a thermal ignition." "Then we use the manual override," Thorne said, reaching into his tactical vest and pulling out the small, brass transit key that had been recovered from Father John Logan's cedar floorboards in Cohasset. Logan kept this key on the same ring as the Berkshire Chapel lockbox. He didn't keep it as a keepsake. He kept it because the mechanical bypass for these old transit safes was designed to use a standard railroad master override. Thorne inserted the brass key into the narrow, vertical slot hidden beneath the corroded dial housing. He applied a slow, steady pressure, the internal brass tumblers letting out a sequence of deep, dry clicks that echoed through the stone chamber like the cocking of a vintage rifle. With a sudden, heavy metallic thud, the internal locking bar disengaged, and the heavy steel lid of the second trunk swung upward, releasing a cold, stale draft of air that smelled of rotted canvas, wet wool, and the unmistakable metallic odor of lead-based primer. Inside the second trunk lay the operational tools of a state-sanctioned execution squad. Arranged on a bed of heavy, oil-stained security blankets from the 1950s were 4 high-carbon steel machining scribes, their handles wrapped in black leather tape to ensure a firm grip, their tips honed to a surgical, diamond-hard point. Beside the scribes sat 2 vintage, 1950s police-issue transit revolvers, their serial numbers systematically ground off using an industrial lathe and a pristine, zinc-lined box containing 23 custom-engraved silver rosaries, each one identical in every detail to the rosary left in Maggie Sullivan's hand, down to the hand-carved Latin warning on the back of the crucifix, Quidquid sub terra est in lusum proferit. This was the family's supply chest, the literal physical inventory of a systematic execution operation that had been passed down from father to son. The silver rosaries were not individual items of religious devotion. They were the serial markers of the syndicate, a systematic calling card left in the hands of the victims to warn the other members of the conspiracy that the price of betrayal had been paid in full. Meanwhile, 6 miles away at the Area C6 precinct, the concrete walls of the maximum security holding unit offered no protection from the digital storm that was currently consuming the nation. Father John Logan sat on the edge of a steel cot, his cassock removed, his frail, wrinkled shoulders hunched forward under the harsh, unblinking glare of the fluorescent safety tubes. He did not look at the heavy iron door of his cell, nor did he respond to the distant, muffled sounds of the protests that had begun to gather outside the precinct gates. But as the electronic chime of the precinct's main television monitor began to broadcast the emergency global news bulletin from the South Boston waterfront, the old priest's fingers began to twitch rhythmically against his knees, his lips moving silently in a low, frantic Latin whisper. The news anchor's voice, projected through the high-sensitivity speakers of the holding wing, was sharp, frantic, and thick with the gravity of an unprecedented political crisis. Federal marshals have officially breached the subterranean foundations of the Commonwealth Pier parking structure, recovering millions of dollars in unrecorded cash, counterfeit land deeds, and a private execution ledger that implicates dozens of high-ranking Massachusetts officials from the 1970s. The scans, which were published live by the independent investigative podcast The Parish Secrets, have triggered immediate resignation demands for 3 current state senators, the Suffolk County Sheriff, and the immediate suspension of all active development permits along the South Boston waterfront. Logan slowly raised his head, his watery, pale gray eyes staring at the tiny, barred window of his cell door. The clinical, self-righteous certainty that had sustained him through 52 years of sanctuary was gone, replaced by the hollow, terrifying realization that his father's perfect system had been completely dismantled. The concrete had not held, the church had not protected him, and the long, freezing silence of South Boston had finally, violently come to an end in the blinding glare of the digital dawn. The deep, hollow metallic clink of the third padlock being sheared away by the hydraulic cutters did not simply signal the opening of the final steel trunk inside the Commonwealth Pier Sea Vault. It sounded the death knell for a multi-generational political dynasty that had ruled Massachusetts from the shadows since the mid-20th century. Under the damp, limestone-dusted granite arches 40 feet beneath the South Boston waterfront, the air had grown freezing cold, heavy with the sharp scent of ozone, seawater, and the distinct, biological decay of 52 years of entombed secrets. Detective Silas Thorne stood with his boots sunk deep in the wet river gravel, his eyes locked on the dark, grease-coated lid of the third container. Beside him, Thomas Byrne held the dual-grip housing of his cinematic digital camera rock-steady, the blinking red recording light capturing every micro-movement of the tactical team for the live, raw feed currently dominating the global internet. The digital counter on Thomas's transmitter registered over 6 million concurrent viewers, a massive, decentralized jury of citizens watching the literal foundations of their state's history being dismantled in real time. There were no studio backdrops, no polished transitions, and no commercial breaks. The raw, Don-Dap, rapid-fire pacing of the broadcast was driven entirely by the rhythmic slap of the high-tide harbor waters against the exterior Quincy granite blocks and the heavy breathing of the tactical operators. The protective shield of the archdiocesan legal injunctions had been completely shattered. The state attorney general's desperate attempts to freeze the scene had failed, and the frantic, late-night phone lines between the State House, the federal courthouse, and the elite country clubs of New England were currently burning with absolute, unadulterated panic. The seal on this third trunk is remarkably tight, the lead forensic technician muttered, using a high-carbon steel pry bar to force the oxidized hinges of the container upward. The interior is completely lined with vulcanized rubber gaskets. It was designed to survive a complete failure of the subterranean dry pumps. If there is water inside, it's not from a harbor. It's condensation that's been trapped since the day the lid was slammed shut. With a deep, wet groan of the rubber seals, the lid of the third trunk swung backward, releasing a sharp, icy draft that made everyone in the small, brick-walled office chamber step back. The scent that filled the room was not the clean liturgical beeswax of the first trunk, nor the chemical oil primer of the second. It was the scent of a sudden, frozen violent struggle. The cold, dry smell of wool fiber, dried lavender perfume, a trace of copper-rich dried blood, and the stale, suffocating dust of a young woman's personal belongings that had been torn from her body in the dark. Inside the third trunk lay the physical reality of Maggie Sullivan's final hours. Resting on the top layer was her navy blue wool winter coat, its brass buttons still tarnished with the sea salt of November 12, 1974. The left sleeve was partially torn at the shoulder seam, indicating that she had been violently grabbed or dragged before she was asphyxiated. Below the coat lay her canvas satchel, its strap sliced clean with a sharp instrument, likely the same high-carbon steel machining scribe that the family used to enforce their silence. The contents of the satchel had been dumped carelessly into the bottom of the steel container. Her university identification card, a half-empty pack of throat lozenges, a bundle of letters from her family in Galway, and her small, silver-plated pocket watch, its hands permanently frozen at exactly 6:04 a.m. She was killed right here, Silas Thorne said, his gravelly voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency that resonated through the digital audio stream like a physical blow. He shone his high-powered tactical light on the interior metal walls of the trunk. Logan didn't just stage her body at the altar of St. Jude's. He brought her down into this sea vault first. He dragged her through the lower sacristy hatch, down the timber shafts, and into this office to interrogate her about where she had hidden the duplicate keys to the financial ledger trunks. He wanted to make sure she hadn't already delivered the copies to the federal marshal. Thomas Byrne adjusted his lens, the camera capturing a tiny, dark stain on the inside of the trunk's rubber gasket. Under the high-intensity ultraviolet light of the forensic scanner, the stain flared with a distinct, glowing yellow-green luminescence, biological trace evidence, preserved for 52 years in the airtight, vulcanized container. The touch DNA on these fabric fibers will be pristine, Sarah Burns' voice came through the command earpiece, her tone sharp with clinical triumph. The rubber seal completely prevented the decomposition of the skin cells. We're going to find Father John Logan's genetic profile on the collar of that wool coat, on the cut strap of the canvas satchel, and on the metal backing of that pocket watch. He didn't just direct the operation from the altar. He was the physical executioner. But as Thorne carefully lifted the water-damaged satchel from the bottom of the trunk, his fingers caught on a false bottom built into the lower lining of the container. With a sharp pull, he removed a thick, cardboard mailing envelope addressed to the United States District Court, Boston, Massachusetts. Attention, Chief Federal Investigator Michael J. Crowley. The envelope was stamped with the date November 11th, 1974, but it had never been mailed. It was sealed with heavy, black electrical tape, its corners worn and stained with grease. "This is the handoff package," Thomas whispered, his camera focusing on the clean, bold handwriting on the front of the parcel. Maggie Sullivan's elegant script was completely legible, written in the same dark blue iron gall ink that had filled her recovered diary. She was going to mail this at the South Boston Postal Terminal before her meeting at the Maritime Warehouse. Logan must have intercepted her at the mailbox or caught her just as she was preparing the package in the sacristy. Thorne used a sterile scalpel to slide through the black tape, opening the envelope to reveal a secondary ledger book, not the financial logs of the Winter Hill offshore transfers, but the private, handwritten dispatch books of the Boston Police Department's Area C, 6 Homicide Division from the late 50s and early 60s. Tucked inside the pages of the police ledger was a single, yellowed photograph depicting a young, clean-shaven Thomas Pendleton, the notorious security chief of the Illinois Central Railroad, standing alongside a group of high-ranking local detectives on the wooden docks of Commonwealth Pier. They were all smiling, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, while behind them, several heavy wooden crates were being unloaded from a private logistics vessel directly into the back of an unmarked police transport truck. "The conspiracy went all the way to the top," Thorne said, his voice hard, his eyes scanning the list of names handwritten on the back of the photograph. The police department wasn't just taking bribes to ignore the waterfront smuggling. They were actively providing the security and the transport for the shipments. The clearance operations that Thomas Pendleton ran in the 50s weren't private security actions. They were joint operations sanctioned by the local precinct commanders to protect the syndicate's monopoly on the docks. And Maggie had the original, unredacted dispatch logs to prove it. The release of the digital scans of the newly recovered police ledger and the historical photograph triggered an immediate, absolute panic across the municipal and state government offices of Massachusetts. By 3 a.m., as the federal extraction team began hoisting the 3 steel trunks up through the concrete gap of the parking structure, the first waves of federal indictments were already being generated by the United States District Court for the District of Massachusetts. The list of targets was a roll call of the state's elite. Federal warrants were issued for the immediate arrest of retired Chief of Detectives Arthur Vance, former State Senator Francis X. Harrington, 2 active judges of the Suffolk County Superior Court, and the current director of the Massachusetts Port Authority. The charges were staggering: federal civil rights conspiracy, capital murder for hire under color of law, interstate transportation of stolen goods, and the systematic obstruction of justice spanning 5 decades. In the hallways of the State House, the lights were burning bright against the freezing rain, the offices of the senior administrators being cleared out in frantic, late-night scrambles as lawyers advised their clients to prepare for immediate surrender to the federal marshals. The political leverage that the old guard had relied on for 50 years had completely dissolved. The decentralized, global audience of the parish secrets had stripped them of their ability to control the narrative, to pressure the local judges, or to buy the silence of the investigators. Back in his concrete holding cell at Area C, 6, Father John Logan sat in absolute darkness, the distant, muffled sirens of the arriving federal transport vans echoing through the reinforced glass of the high windows. He could hear the low, heavy vibration of the harbor wind howling through the alleyways of South Boston, a wild, morning sound that seemed to carry the voices of all the young women who had been silenced beneath his altar. His hands, still secured by the heavy steel handcuffs, were cold, his fingers tracing the invisible contours of a silver collar as he prepared to face the unblinking, blinding light of a federal courtroom. The sanctuary of the church was gone, the concrete vaults had been broken, and the final, devastating reckoning of St. Jude's Parish was officially, beautifully underway. The dawn that broke over Boston Harbor on the morning of November 13th, 2026, did not bring warmth. It brought a cold, blinding exposure that laid bare the rusted, hollowed-out pillars of the city's oldest power networks. At exactly 8 a.m., the massive bronze doors of the John W. McCormick Post Office and courtroom in the heart of the city were besieged by a wall of humanity. A dense, roaring crowd of journalists, legal analysts, local residents, and the younger generation of South Boston filled the icy plaza, their breath rising in thick, white plumes into the sub-zero air. The freezing sleet had coated the high-rise facades in a glass-like sheen, but the real storm was inside, where the federal judicial machinery was moving with an unprecedented, high-velocity momentum. The emergency broadcast of Maggie Sullivan's recovered final handoff package on the parish secrets had completely stripped the local establishment of its traditional defensive weapons. There would be no quiet, backroom plea negotiations, no strategic delays in state courts, and no convenient bureaucratic fires to consume the evidence. Inside the high-ceilinged corridor of the federal courthouse, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of wet wool, hot coffee, and the sharp, chemical tang of high-security floor wax. Armed federal marshals stood at 5-foot intervals along the mahogany-paneled walls, their tactical gear a stark contrast to the neoclassical marble arches of the building. They were preparing for the formal arraignment of Father John Logan, a proceeding that the United States Department of Justice had elevated to a high-priority civil rights prosecution under the federal color of law execution statutes. Behind the defense table, Logan's newly assembled legal team sat in a state of quiet, hyper-focused panic. The team was led by Arthur Vance, not the retired police captain implicated in the papers, but his nephew, a high-priced, razor-sharp corporate defense attorney who had spent his career insulating the city's elite from federal grand juries. Vance sat surrounded by boxes of printed digital transcripts from Burns' podcast, his fingers frantically scanning the multispectral scans of Maggie's diary and the newly unsealed 1974 logistics ledger. He knew the state-level protective orders his firm had secured only hours prior were now legally worthless. "They aren't just prosecuting a 81-year-old priest, John," Vance whispered, leaning close to Logan's ear. The old priest sat perfectly straight in his high-backed chair, his face an impenetrable mask of parchment-dry skin, his watery gray eyes staring blankly at the empty witness stand. "They're using the federal civil rights statutes to bypass the 50-year statute of limitations on the state conspiracy charges. If they can prove that the archdiocese and the local precinct operated as a joint criminal enterprise to deny Maggie Sullivan her constitutional rights, they can seize every asset, every property deed, and every bank account tied to those 1974 transactions. We have to file for a total venue change. We cannot get an impartial jury in the state of Massachusetts after last night's broadcast." Logan slowly turned his head, his silver hair catching the sharp glare of the courtroom's modern LED lights. A faint, dry rattle emerged from his throat, a cold, mocking sound that carried the absolute, unyielding arrogance of a man who had spent his entire life believing the church's sanctuary was the only authority that mattered. "You speak of the jury as if they're the ones who hold the keys, Arthur," Logan whispered, his voice surprisingly deep, carrying that same theatrical, high-pulpit resonance that had once commanded the pews of St. Jude's. "The people in that gallery do not understand the weight of the stone. They think they want the truth, but they only want a show. They want to see the old collar drag through the mud because it makes them feel progressive. But they still walk on the concrete we laid. They still use the terminals we built. They cannot condemn the hand that kept their house from falling into the sea." "The hand is blood on it, John," Vance hissed, his voice tight with desperation. "The forensic lab just completed the touch DNA analysis on the collar of Maggie's wool coat. It's an absolute, flawless match to your genetic profile. They found her skin cells embedded in the wool fibers where you grabbed her from behind in the sacristy. The technology of 2026 doesn't care about your pastoral authority. It treats you like a common biological trace. Before Logan could respond, the side door of the courtroom swung open and the bailiff's voice boomed through the silent room. All rise for the Honorable Margaret Brennan, Chief Judge of the United States District Court. The gallery fell into a dead, suffocating silence as Judge Brennan stepped onto the bench, her expression a hard, unforgiving mask of judicial authority. She did not look at the cameras mounted in the back of the room. She looked directly at the defense table, her eyes locking onto Father John Logan with a clinical, unblinking intensity that set the tone for the entire proceeding. We are here for the formal arraignment of the defendant, John Logan, on federal charges of capital civil rights conspiracy, interstate transportation of stolen property, and first-degree murder under color of law. Judge Brennan began, her voice carrying an absolute, unyielding clarity that resonated through the digital audio lines to the millions of listeners waiting outside. She looked down at the state attorney general, Richard Devlin, who sat in the front row of the gallery, his face pale, his hands trembling as he stared at the floor. The court notes the filing of multiple emergency motions by the defense to seal the evidence recovered from the Commonwealth Pier parking structure. Those motions are hereby denied in their entirety. The physical evidence, including the 3 steel trunks and the personal effects of Margaret Sullivan, was recovered pursuant to a valid, federally authorized search warrant. The court finds no basis for ecclesiastical privilege in a matter involving the systematic execution of a United States citizen. The prosecution's lead representative, Assistant U.S. Attorney Evelyn Reed, stepped to the podium. She was a young, relentless federal prosecutor whose career had been built on dismantling organized crime syndicates in New York and Chicago. She did not rely on the emotional, dramatic language of a local district attorney. She presented the case with the cold, chronological precision of an industrial architect. "Your Honor," Reed said, her voice echoing off the high marble walls. "The government is seeking the absolute, permanent detention of the defendant without bail. We are presenting the court with a documented history of 52 years of systematic evasion, institutional concealment, and the active destruction of state and federal records. The defendant is not merely an elderly retiree. He is the custodian of an active, multi-million-dollar criminal archive that has been used to influence the political and judicial elections of this city for half a century. If he is released on any form of bail, the resources of his ecclesiastical and corporate partners will be deployed instantly to extract him from the jurisdiction, just as they did in 1974. She tapped her digital tablet, bringing up a high-resolution scan of the 3rd steel trunk's contents, the small, silver-plated pocket watch, its hands frozen at 6:04 a.m., and the pristine, zinc-lined box containing the custom-engraved silver rosaries. The evidence recovered last night proves that the murder of Maggie Sullivan was not an isolated act of passion or panic, Reed continued, her finger pointing to the screen. It was a structured, corporate execution. The silver rosary left in her hand was a signature, a warning designed by the defendant and his father to signal to the other members of the Atlantic Logistics Syndicate that the price of betrayal had been paid. The defendant kept Maggie's diary, her watch, and her personal correspondence in a subterranean sea vault to act as his personal insurance policy against his own partners. He used the memory of his victim to guarantee his own survival. That is not a pastoral service, Your Honor. That is the behavior of a cold, calculating racketeer. Thomas Burns stood in the media gallery, his camera lens focused on Logan's face as the federal prosecutor laid out the mechanics of his empire. On the screen of his monitor, the old priest's expression did not change, but his fingers began to trace a slow, circular pattern against his knee, the phantom movement of a man who had spent 50 years counting the beads of a rosary he no longer held. "How do you plead to the charges, Mr. Logan?" Judge Brennan's voice cut through the room like a hammer blow. Logan slowly stood up, refusing the assistance of his defense attorney. He adjusted his collar, his silver head held high, his pale eyes looking past the judge, past the prosecutors, directly into the camera lens that was broadcasting his face to the world. "The church does not answer to the harbor, Judge," Logan said, his voice dropping to a low, rhythmic rattle that carried the chilling, absolute self-righteousness of a man who believed his metrics were entirely beyond the comprehension of the secular court. The work we did at St. Jude's was the only thing that kept the light burning in the city when the winter was cold and the docks were empty. If we did not secure the property, if we did not protect the line from those who wanted to tear it down, there would be no Boston for you to govern today. I do not plead to your charges, because your laws did not build this house. A plea of not guilty will be entered on behalf of the defendant, Judge Brennan said, her voice dropping into a hard, dangerous register that carried the absolute finality of the federal bench. The defendant is remanded to the custody of the United States Marshal Service to be held in continuous, administrative maximum isolation at the Plymouth County Correctional Facility. There will be no bail, no visitors other than legal counsel, and no access to diocesan communications. This court is adjourned. As the heavy steel handcuffs clicked back around Logan's wrists, the marshals stepped forward to lead him out of the room. The gallery erupted into a chaotic, roaring wave of noise, shouting reporters, crying family members, and the distant, thunderous chants of the crowd outside the plaza. But as the old priest reached the heavy door of the secure transport wing, he stopped, his gaze locking onto Thomas Byrne one final time. "You have your recording, young man," Logan whispered, a faint, chilling smile touching his thin lips. "But the concrete is deep, and the tide is still rising." Thomas kept his lens locked on the priest until the heavy iron door slammed shut, the final, mechanical latch clicking into place with a sharp, definitive sound that echoed through the quiet of his headphones. The long, freezing winter of 1974 was finally over. The silence of St. Jude's Parish had been shattered, the red tacks had been pulled from the map, and the city of Boston, built on the bones of the forgotten, was finally, beautifully beginning to breathe. Part 11. The digital telemetry feeds routing from the subterranean chambers of the Commonwealth Pier parking structure to the command monitors of Area C6 did not merely register geological anomalies, they recorded the physical excavation of a city's buried conscience. At exactly 1:14 p.m., the specialized sub-bottom profiling sonar, deployed by a team of federal forensic engineers, sent a sequence of high-frequency acoustic pulses through the thick, salt-saturated mud of the inner harbor channel. On the digital displays inside the mobile command trailer, the gray, layered cross-sections of the historical seawall began to resolve into sharp, geometric wireframes. Below the 19th-century granite blocks, tucked inside the deep, tide-locked lateral drifts that had been capped with reinforced concrete in 1974, lay the structural voids that the Atlantic Logistics Syndicate had used as their private, maritime graveyard. Detective Silas Thorne stood with his hands resting on the edge of the metal console, his eyes bloodshot, his face pale with the immense physical and emotional exhaustion of a 48-hour run that had systematically dismantled a 70-year-old dynasty of municipal execution. Beside him, Thomas Byrne kept his fingers hovering over the master control panel of his mobile digital transmitter. The live broadcast feed of the parish secrets was currently displaying a real-time, three-dimensional model of the harbor floor, the small red indicators marking the locations of the hidden sea vaults blinking in the low light like a sequence of silent, subterranean distress signals. The structural integrity of the third cavity is highly compromised. The lead recovery engineer's voice crackled through the tactical intercom, his tone professional, clinical, yet carrying a distinct, nervous edge that made the earpiece vibrate. The tide is rising, and the salt water is beginning to seep through the old timber joints at the eastern end of the pier. If we don't deploy the pneumatic bladder dams to isolate the workspace within the next 20 minutes, the entire lateral drift will be flooded with 6 feet of freezing harbor water, and we will lose the structural context of the remains. "Deploy the dams," Thorne commanded, his voice a flat, gravelly rasp that carried the absolute finality of the law. "And tell the recovery team to prepare the titanium lifting frames. We are not leaving any passenger behind in the mud tonight." The descent into the flooded depths of the seawall was carried out under the maximum security protocols of the United States Marshal Service. As Thomas Byrne followed Thorne down the wet, vibrating metal ladders of the main maintenance shaft, the air grew rapidly colder, thicker, and saturated with the heavy, chemical tang of high-density concrete solvent, and the ancient, frozen dampness of the underground narrow-gauge rail lines. The workspace was a chaotic hive of bright yellow industrial power lines, high-velocity air-scrubbing units, and forensic specialists clad in white, positive-pressure protective suits, their faces obscured by the reflective plastic visors of their respirator masks. The second and third concrete vaults sat in the center of the lateral drift, surrounded by piles of pulverized limestone and rusted iron brackets that had been sheared away by the diamond-tipped saws during the midnight breach. The forensic team had already cut a clean, rectangular block out of the outer concrete layer, revealing the dark, oxidized surface of a second zinc-lined utility locker, this one bearing the serial number AL 1974-12. "We are preparing to release the vacuum seal," the lead technician said, his hand resting on the valve of a specialized air sampling canister. "The interior pressure is significantly higher than the ambient tunnel atmosphere. We're going to extract the headspace gas first to analyze for volatile organic compounds before we open the latch." With a sharp, high-pitched hiss of escaping air, the pressure equalized. The technician stepped back, signaling to the two operators holding the hydraulic cutting shears. The heavy brass padlocks, rusted into solid lumps of green metal, were snapped in a fraction of a second, their broken pieces falling to the concrete floor with a heavy, hollow clink. Thomas raised his handheld camera, the lens focusing on the lid as it was slowly pried upward by two gloved hands. The interior of the second locker was a terrifyingly precise mirror of the first, but the items preserved inside reflected a different, more sophisticated era of obsession. Resting on a bed of clean, blue wool railway blankets was a collection of personal items that had belonged to Rebecca Vance, her leather-bound historical research journals, her laminated Chicago Historical Society identification badge, and a gold-plated fountain pen that had been engraved with her initials. But next to her belongings sat a secondary, smaller container, a vintage wooden cigar box, its cedar surface darkened by decades of subterranean moisture. Elena knelt down, her gloved fingers carefully lifting the lid of the cedar box. Inside sat a collection of 23 brass transit tokens from the 1950s, each one meticulously wrapped in a small piece of grease-stained paper. Written on each paper wrapper, in the dark blue iron gall ink of Thomas Pendleton, was a date, a location along the South Side line, and a single, handwritten female name. This was the original ledger of the strikes, the physical proof of the disappearances that Rebecca Vance had uncovered in the archives before she was systematically silenced by the old machinist and his father. "The registry was real, Elena," Liam whispered, his camera tracking the names on the wrappers. Every token was a transit ticket for a passenger who never arrived. They kept the tokens to prove to their developer partners that the corridors were clear, that the obstacles had been permanently removed from the right-of-way. They kept them because they believed they were gods, Elena said, her voice shaking with a quiet, icy fury. They believed that as long as they controlled the tracks, they controlled the history of this city. But they ran out of line, Arthur. The train has finally stopped. At exactly 7 a.m., the third and final concrete cavity was breached. This was the deepest vault, cast into the very foundation of the old Monroe Street station platform. Inside the zinc-lined locker ICR 2003-10, the team recovered the physical evidence that would seal Arthur Pendleton's fate in a federal court for the rest of his natural life. The personal, leather-bound journal of Clara Hughes, her university research folders, and the original high-carbon steel machining scribe used to sever her spinal cord in the Hyde Park alleyway. The weapon had been preserved in a clean, oil-stained cloth, its tip still holding the microscopic, dried residue of her blood, a perfect, undeniable forensic match that no defense attorney could ever challenge. The recovery of the 3 lockers was complete. As the heavy crane trucks began the slow, loud work of hoisting the historic evidence containers up to the street level, Elena and Liam stood on the steps of the Dirksen Federal Building, their coats zipped tight against the freezing mountain winds blowing off Lake Michigan. The sun had finally broken through the high gray clouds, casting a brilliant, blinding light across the ice-slicked high-rises of the Loop, turning the concrete of the city into a sparkling, clean white canvas. "What happens now, Elena?" Liam asked, his camera finally turned off, his hand resting in his pocket. "We go back to work," she said, her voice carrying a deep, emotional warmth that seemed to cut through the freezing morning air. "We have 70 years of files to reopen. We have to find every family on that map, and we have to give them their daughters back. We have to make sure that the names of the people who built this city are written in the light, not hidden in the dark." She looked back toward the open mouth of the maintenance shaft, where the forensic teams were still working in the steam. The long, freezing winter of 2003 was finally over. The silence had been shattered, the tracks had been cleared of their monsters, and the city of Chicago, built on the bones of the forgotten, was finally, beautifully beginning to breathe. 2 weeks later, the sky over the South Side Cemetery was a brilliant, cloudless blue. There were no television cameras, no political press releases, and no high society city council members gathering under the trees. The crowd was small. Only Detective Elena Vance, Liam Vance, Judge Arthur Vance, and a handful of elderly residents who had never forgotten the girls who had disappeared into the soot. At the center of the green lawn, a beautiful, polished granite headstone sat bathed in the warm, golden light of the morning sun. It did not bear the dusty, anonymous label of a cold case folder. Carved deep into the stone, in elegant, clean letters, was a name that had finally been restored to the light. Clara Hughes. August 14th, 1984 to October 24th, 2003. The snow has cleared. The tracks are silent. The passenger is home. Elena stood by the grave, her hands tucked deep into her pockets, watching as a single, fresh white rose was placed against the base of the stone. The cold case of 2003 was no longer a cold case. The circle was closed. The predator was locked in a concrete cage of his own making, and the truth, 70 years in the making, had finally, beautifully set the city free. The granite monuments of South Boston's Mount Benedict Cemetery stood like silent sentinels under the sharp, pale spring sun of May 2026. The bitter, freezing sleet that had defined the dramatic winter raids along the Calumet canals and the Commonwealth Pier had finally retreated, leaving behind a crisp, relentless morning wind that rustled the freshly bloomed cherry blossoms. There were no television crews allowed inside the cemetery gates. No political press secretaries from the State House, no high-ranking municipal authorities seeking to salvage their public images, and no media vans blocking the narrow, winding stone pathways. The crowd gathered near the edge of the hillside overlooking the Boston shipping channels was remarkably small, a quiet, solemn assembly of those who had carried the crushing weight of the silence for 52 years. Detective Silas Thorne stood at the rear of the gathering, his heavy wool police coat unbuttoned, his hands resting in his pockets. His face, etched with the deep, permanent lines of a career spent chasing ghosts through the city's industrial back alleys, was entirely still. Beside him, Thomas Byrne held his digital recording suite at his side, the lens of his camera capped, the red blinking light of his transmitter finally dark. They were not there as investigators or as broadcasters. They were there as witnesses to the final, necessary closure of a wound that had festered in the dark since the rainy morning of November 12, 1974. At the center of the green lawn, resting on a pair of polished oak supports, was a simple, elegant mahogany casket containing the remains of Maggie Sullivan. The federal forensic teams had completed their systematic, microcellular cataloging of her clothing and the personal effects recovered from the third zinc-lined sea vault. Every biological trace had been preserved, every fiber match had been logged into the federal indictments, and the physical reality of her final hours had been officially enshrined in the permanent archives of the United States District Court. The system had tried to turn her into an anonymous transaction, a hidden cost of the waterfront's concrete expansion, but the digital dragnet had dragged her name back into the blinding light of the modern world. As the priest, a young, external curate assigned by the Metropolitan Diocese to oversee the service with absolute, unblemished transparency, began the final committal prayers, his voice carried a quiet, shaking warmth that cut through the steady hum of the distant harbor traffic. "We commit the body of our sister, Margaret, to the earth, the The priest whispered, his hand gently scattering a small handful of dry, white sand across the polished lid of the casket. Not as one who was forgotten in the weeds of the right-of-way, but as a daughter of this neighborhood whose voice refused to be silenced by the concrete. The stone has been rolled away, the vaults have been opened, and the passenger has finally, beautifully reached her home. Thomas looked past the casket to the front row of the mourners, where several elderly women from the old St. Jude's parish sat wrapped in heavy woolen shawls, their tear-streaked faces tilted toward the spring sky. Among them was Maggie's younger sister, Kathleen, who had been only 10 years old when the police had told her family that Maggie had simply run away with a transit laborer. Kathleen's hand trembled as she held a small, silver-plated pocket watch, the very watch recovered from the third steel trunk, its hands now professionally cleaned and set to the correct, active time of the morning. The frozen cycle of 1974 had finally been broken, and the ticking of the gears was a soft, rhythmic heartbeat of justice that echoed across the hillside. Behind them, the skyline of Boston rose like a massive, glass and steel mountain range against the blue horizon, the towering commercial cranes of the new waterfront still idling under the temporary federal suspension orders. The systematic, multi-jurisdictional indictments unleashed by the discovery of the sea vaults had completely paralyzed the city's development syndicates. The $75,000 annual protection wire transfers, the counterfeit land deeds, and the private execution registries of the Atlantic Logistics Division were now public, unerasable digital records, currently being audited by a special federal task force. The old guard's protective alliances had collapsed entirely. The state attorney general's resignation had been finalized. 3 senior judges of the Suffolk County Superior Court were awaiting trial, and the corporate entities that had funded the Pendleton and Logan dynasties were liquidating their regional assets to prepare for the massive, incoming civil litigation. But the true center of the day's reckoning lay 6 miles to the south, inside the maximum security medical wing of the FMC Devens Federal Facility. Father John Logan sat in a wheelchair positioned in the center of a sterile, white-walled courtyard, his hands resting flat on his knees, his cassock permanently replaced by a simple, orange institutional jumpsuit. The high-security stone walls of St. Jude's Haven in Cohasset were a distant memory, replaced by the unyielding, clinical geometry of a federal prison. He was 81 years old, his physical health rapidly deteriorating under the stress of his continuous, administrative maximum isolation, but his eyes, pale, watery, and incredibly sharp, remained fixed on the high, concrete wall above him, where a single, black-winged gull circled in the cold sky. He did not have a silver rosary to count. He did not have the keys to the lower sacristy cabinet or the leather-bound diaries of the young women he had systematically cleared from his sanctuary. The federal court had stripped him of all ecclesiastical titles, all private assets, and all communication privileges with the diocesan chancellors who had protected him for 52 years. He was no longer a custodian of the city's secrets. He was a federal prisoner, waiting for a trial that would ensure he spent his remaining, shallow breaths in absolute, unyielding isolation. Silas Thorne walked slowly down the gravel path of the cemetery, his boots crunching softly on the dry stones, his eyes catching the brilliant, golden reflection of the sun off Maggie's new granite headstone. The surface of the dark marble had been carved with clean, elegant letters that would stand against the New England winters for centuries to come. Margaret Maggie Sullivan. October 3rd, 1952 to November 12th, 1974. Whatever is under the earth, it will bring to light. Thomas Burns stepped up beside the detective, his hand resting on the top of the granite monument. The digital servers are completely stable, Silas, he said, his voice quiet, filled with a peaceful, solemn resolve. The final episode of The Parish Secrets has reached 12 million downloads. The names of every girl marked on that 1974 map have been integrated into the National Civil Rights Registry. The old guard can't rebuild the walls. There's too much light in the room now. We did our job, Thomas, Thorne said, a faint, rare smile breaking through the weathered creases of his face as he looked out over the blue waters of the shipping channel. We took the files out of the basement, we broke the concrete, and we gave them back their names. The city is going to keep moving, the trains will still run, and the cranes will start turning again. But they'll have to build on a foundation of truth from now on. He turned back toward the winding path, his coat catching the sharp spring wind as he walked toward the exit gates. The long, freezing winter of 1974 was finally completely over. The silence of St. Jude's Sanctuary had been shattered, the red tax had been pulled from the historical registry, and the city of Boston, built on the bones of the forgotten, was finally, beautifully beginning to breathe. The granite monuments of South Boston's Mount Benedict Cemetery stood like silent sentinels under the sharp, pale spring sun of May 2026. The bitter, freezing sleet that had defined the dramatic winter raids along the Calumet canals and the Commonwealth Pier had finally retreated,